February of 1942 was cold in southern England, the kind of cold that settled into the bones of old buildings and refused to leave until spring forced it out. Across the country, the war was grinding into its third year, and the landscape carried the particular exhaustion of a nation that had survived the worst of the bombing but not yet glimpsed the end of the fighting. Rationing had hollowed out kitchen cupboards. Men were absent from households in every village and town, and somewhere outside the small community of Wraysbury in Berkshire, beside a narrow stretch of water that connected the village to the Thames, a child was born in circumstances that no official record would bother to dramatize, and that the world would eventually find impossible to ignore. The structure where Christine Keeler came into the world on February 22, 1942 was not a house in any conventional sense. It was a converted railway carriage, pulled from service, stripped of its wheels, and set onto a rough foundation on a plot of land that sat close to the Colne Brook. Its windows were small and steamed in winter. Its walls were thin enough that the sound of water carried through them on quiet nights. The carriage had been divided into rooms by the resourcefulness of a family with no money to build anything better, and the wind found its way in regardless of the season. This was not poverty that polite society acknowledged. It was the kind of poverty that England was very skilled at pretending did not exist, particularly in the leafy counties immediately west of London, where the villages looked pretty enough and the hedgerows were always neatly trimmed. Christine's mother was a young woman named June, who had managed the kind of wartime life that many women of her background endured without complaint and without much choice. Christine's biological father, a man named Ted Keeler, was not a significant presence. He and June separated when Christine was very young, and his departure left behind no great rupture in the girl's daily existence, largely because his existence had barely registered to begin with. What replaced him was the ordinary struggle of a woman trying to raise a child on very little, and eventually a stepfather named Edward Hewish, who moved into the railway carriage and brought with him the particular atmosphere of a household that had never quite been given the space it needed to breathe. Wraysbury was a quiet place in those years and in the years that followed. It sat in a flat stretch of countryside where the land was low and frequently damp, threaded through with waterways and gravel pits. The village had its church and its pub and its small school, and the families who lived there moved through a world circumscribed by habit and proximity. There was little money and few aspirations that reached beyond the fields and the local shops. Children grew up knowing roughly where they would land, knowing which boys they might eventually marry, knowing what work would likely be available. The future in a place like Wraysbury was not so much unknown as it was predictable, and it was predictable in a way that offered no particular elevation. What Christine had, from the beginning, was a face. This sounds like a simple thing, but in the England of the late 1940s and 1950s, where beauty was simultaneously prized and viewed with a certain suspicion by those who possessed neither beauty nor the means to acquire elegance, it was not nothing. The girl who grew up in the railway carriage was striking in a way that the village noticed and the village could not quite decide what to do with. She was dark-haired, with high cheekbones and a quality of watchful stillness in her features that made her appear older than her years, or at least more present. She had learned early what children from such households often learn: to read rooms, to sense shifts in mood, to understand the emotional weather of the people around her before it became a storm. She attended school in Wraysbury and later in nearby Staines, doing what was required without distinction. Education in the 1950s, for a girl of her background, was never seriously presented as a route to anything transformative. The curriculum was adequate. The expectations were modest. Girls were prepared for domestic life, for employment in shops or offices, for the kind of orderly existence that the post-war social project was designed to produce. Christine absorbed the lessons she was given and found them profoundly insufficient. Not because she was rebellious in any dramatic sense. She was not the sort of girl who caused trouble in obvious ways, but because the gap between the life being offered and whatever it was she could feel at the edges of her own imagination was wider than the schoolroom was willing to acknowledge. Post-war Britain was in the middle of a strange and contradictory period. The welfare state had been born. The National Health Service had come into existence in 1948, promising that the class you were born into would no longer determine whether you received a doctor's care. Social housing was being built. The language of equality was in the air, carried forward on the energy of a labor government that had genuinely reshaped parts of the landscape. And yet, beneath all of this, the old structure of British society remained almost completely intact. The same families owned the same land. The same schools produced the same cabinet ministers. The same accents opened the same doors, and the same lack of accent kept those doors firmly closed. The welfare state had given working people greater security. It had not given them access. Christine grew up feeling the presence of this invisible wall without having the vocabulary to describe it. What she understood was a question of texture. The texture of the railway carriage against the texture of the larger houses she could see from the road, the texture of her mother's worn coat against the fabric of the clothes worn by the women who shopped in the better stores in the nearby towns. She understood that some people moved through the world with a looseness and an ease that her family did not possess, and that this ease was not earned but inherited, passed down through accents and addresses and bank accounts in ways that no amount of effort would simply dissolve. She was 16 years old, or close to it, when she began to understand that London existed in a way that was different from anything she had experienced within reach of Wraysbury. Girls her age who managed to find themselves in London could find work, in shops, in offices, in restaurants, in the kind of late-night establishments that were beginning to proliferate in the years following the lifting of wartime austerity. The city was loosening. It was not yet the swinging London that would become a cultural mythology by the mid-60s. But the early tremors were already detectable in the new coffee bars, the jazz clubs, the late-night venues where young people were beginning to invent a version of British life that their parents would not have recognized. Her home circumstances deteriorated further in her teenage years. The details of this period of her life are not uniformly documented, but Christine would later describe a household where warmth was conditional and privacy was non-existent, where the cramped space of the converted carriage pressed down on its occupants with a weight that had nothing to do with its modest dimensions. She had a half-brother and a half-sister by this point, the children of her mother and stepfather, and the family's resources were stretched accordingly. What she felt, with increasing certainty as she moved through her mid-teens, was not so much ambition, not in the way the word is typically used, but something closer to a physical need for distance. A need to get out. In 1959, when she was 17, she made her move. She left Wraysbury with few possessions and no guarantee of anything, and she went to London. It would be easy, knowing what came later, to assign this departure some dramatic significance, to frame it as the first step on a road that led inexorably toward crisis and catastrophe. But the truth was simpler and sadder than that. She was a young woman from a poor household who had made the entirely ordinary decision that the life available to her in a Berkshire village was not the life she was willing to accept. Thousands of young women made exactly the same calculation in exactly the same years. Most of them disappeared into the city and found exactly what the city had always offered the poor and the young and the hopeful: a great deal of labor for very little reward, a room in a shared house, and a slow recalibration of expectations. Christine Keeler was not going to disappear. She was too beautiful for that, and beauty in London in 1959, if you knew the right way to deploy it, could get you through doors that remained closed to almost everyone else. She did not know yet which doors those were. She did not know who held the keys. But she was about to find out, in the particular way that young women who arrive in cities without money or connections always find out, through the assistance of people who present themselves as friends and whose interest in you is never quite what it initially appears to be. The railway carriage on the bank of the Cone Brook sat quiet behind her as she left. She would not be returning to the life it represented. She was moving toward a world that was, in every external respect, its opposite, a world of country houses and government ministers, of grand rooms and expensive whiskey, of men who wore their power as casually as their Seville row suits. She had no way of knowing any of this yet. She only knew that she was gone, and that somewhere ahead of her was a city that was beginning, very slowly, to crack itself open. The crack would eventually run all the way to Downing Street. But that story was still 2 years away. First, there was London to survive. A girl born in a converted railway carriage beside a river in Berkshire. No money, no connections, nothing but a face the world could not look away from. And within 3 years she would be at the center of a scandal that reached the Secretary of State for War, a Soviet intelligence officer, and the highest levels of British government. If that is what brought you here, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This story is about to move fast, and you are going to want to see every turn it takes. London in the late 1950s was a city in the middle of becoming something it had not yet decided to be. The worst of the post-war austerity was behind it. Rationing had finally ended in 1954, and the subsequent years had brought a slow, uneven brightening to a city that had spent a decade rebuilding itself from rubble. New buildings filled the gaps left by the Blitz. Department stores restocked themselves with goods that had seemed impossible only a few years before. The buses ran, the underground ran, and the streets of the West End filled on Friday and Saturday evenings with a population that was beginning, cautiously, to enjoy itself again. But London was also a city of profound contradictions, and nowhere were those contradictions more visible than in the entertainment district of Soho, that dense cluster of streets between Oxford Street and Shaftesbury Avenue where the city's official tolerance toward pleasure and its unofficial tolerance toward vice had always overlapped in complicated ways. Soho contained restaurants where you could eat Italian food at a time when Italian food still seemed exotic to most English palates. It contained jazz clubs and coffee bars where the city's younger generation had begun congregating in ways that baffled their parents. It contained bookshops and art galleries and the kinds of private drinking establishments that the English middle class had always maintained while insisting they disapproved of excess. And in Soho, on Beak Street, there was Murray's Cabaret Club. Murray's was, by the standards of the era, a sophisticated establishment. It operated on a members-only basis, which meant that its clientele were screened, or at least presented with the illusion of being screened, which is to say that the people who entered its doors were generally wealthy, generally male, and generally the kind of men who required a degree of discretion from the establishments they frequented. The club ran dinner and a show, which was a polite way of describing an evening in which well-dressed men consumed expensive food and drink while watching young women perform on a small stage in various states of undress. The performances were technically classified as cabaret, and the women who performed in them were technically classified as entertainers, and everyone in the room understood perfectly well what the actual transaction was, even if nobody chose to describe it with precision. Murray's was not a strip club in the crude sense of the term. It maintained an atmosphere, tablecloths, proper stemware, a house band, an MC who introduced the acts with a veneer of theatrical gravity. The girls who worked the floor and performed the shows were expected to be presentable in the way that expensive things were expected to be presentable. They were required to have some quality of the kind of elegance that the clientele associated with high-class entertainment, even if the salary they were paid suggested that the management understood their actual economic vulnerability with perfect clarity. Christine Keeler arrived in London with 17 years behind her and little else. She had, according to her own later account, found her first London employment as a model and a salesgirl, drifting through the kinds of work that young women of limited means and striking appearance fell into naturally, wearing clothes for photographers, standing in shop windows, navigating the low end of a city that was full of people willing to offer work of an ambiguous nature to girls who needed money and did not have the experience to examine the fine print carefully. How she came to Murray's is a matter of some variation between accounts. What is consistent is that by sometime in 1959, she was working there as a showgirl, one of a small company of young women who performed the nightly entertainment. She was 17 when she arrived, or very close to it, young enough that the work required her to add a year or two to her age on the paperwork, a practice common enough in establishments of Murray's kind that nobody bothered to examine it too carefully. The management of Murray's, under the ownership of Percy Murray, selected their girls primarily on the basis of appearance, and Christine's appearance was striking by any measure. What was Murray's like in those years? The surviving accounts from people who worked there or patronized it describe an establishment that occupied a careful middle ground between respectability and license. The shows were topless by the standards of the time, which is to say that the girls performed in costumes that left the upper body exposed in ways that the licensing authorities had, over many years of negotiation and compromise, come to permit. The audiences were predominantly male, predominantly middle-aged, predominantly the kind of professionals who could afford the membership fees and the prices on the menu. There was no obvious criminality about the place, no prostitution conducted on the premises, no overt solicitation, but the atmosphere was one in which the distance between the men in the audience and the women on the stage was both carefully maintained and carefully designed to not be so great as to make the evening feel merely transactional. For Christine, the work was a significant step up from anything available in Wraysbury, or for that matter from most of what was available to a girl of her background in London. The pay was modest but regular. She was fed and kept busy. She was around people, around a particular kind of people, the kind who had money and confidence and access to the city's better rooms. She was, for the first time, in proximity to the upper tiers of a social world she had previously observed only from a considerable distance. She was not alone in this. Murray's attracted a consistent population of young women who shared something of her background, if not always her particular circumstances, girls from poor families, girls from provincial towns, girls who had come to London with some version of the same hope that had driven Christine out of Berkshire. They worked together, competed gently with each other, and navigated together the complex social dynamics of a workplace where the power ran entirely in one direction. They were, in most of the ways that mattered, at the bottom of the hierarchy even when they were the centerpiece of the evening's entertainment. But Murray's was also, and this is the detail that made it genuinely significant in the story that followed, a place that attracted a particular type of man. Mixed in among the businessmen and the tourists and the members of parliament who liked to spend their evenings somewhere that was not quite the gentleman's club but was also not quite the pub, there were men on the edges of the social world. Men who moved between different registers of English life, men who knew everybody and were known by everybody and whose specific occupation was sometimes difficult to define. Men who collected connections the way others collected stamps or rare books. Men whose value to the people around them lay not in their own power but in their extraordinary ability to make introductions. It was in this category that Stephen Ward existed. Ward was in his mid-40s when Christine first encountered him at Murray's, though the precise date of their meeting is uncertain. He was a regular at the club, a man who valued the atmosphere and the company and who was very much the sort of person that the management of such an establishment was likely to cultivate. He was good-looking in the way of a certain type of Englishman who ages well without losing the quality of being interesting to look at. He had dark hair, well-kept, and the kind of features that suggested either good breeding or the confident posture that good breeding was supposed to produce. He dressed impeccably. He spoke with an accent that placed him somewhere in the educated middle class, several registers above the provincial working class but not quite the clipped precision of the genuine upper tier. He was an osteopath by profession, one of the most sought-after osteopaths in London, in fact, with a practice at 38 Devonshire Street that served a clientele remarkable for its elevation. Politicians came to Stephen Ward's consulting room. Aristocrats came. Senior military men came. Ambassadors came. He had an extraordinary talent for the manual reduction of physical discomfort, and he had an equally extraordinary talent for using the intimacy of the consulting bed, the way that pain makes people vulnerable, the way that relief makes them grateful, to cement the kind of personal bond that opened subsequent social doors. But Ward's reputation rested on more than his medical practice. He was also a genuinely gifted portrait artist whose charcoal sketches of prominent individuals were collected and admired. He had drawn members of the royal family. He had drawn politicians and diplomats. His sketchbooks were a record of the social world he inhabited, a world that spanned, with a fluency that was genuinely unusual, the distance from the highest reaches of the English establishment down to the clubs and parties and informal gatherings where the city's underworld brushed against its overworld. Ward knew duchesses and he knew call girls, and he was equally at ease with both, and this ease was the secret of his extraordinary social utility. He noticed Christine Keeler at Murray's in the way that men who collected beautiful and interesting young women always noticed them, quickly, appreciatively, and with the kind of professional calculation that was dressed up as warmth. He introduced himself, as he invariably did, with charm and without obvious agenda. He made her laugh. He made her feel seen in the particular way that older men with experience and confidence could make 17 or 18-year-old girls feel seen, with a quality of attention that implied she was remarkable and that suggested he had recognized something in her that others had missed. He was not sexually interested in her, or at least not primarily so. This is one of the genuinely complicated aspects of Ward's character that his contemporaries consistently noted. His interest in young women was real but not straightforwardly predatory in the conventional sense. He collected them the way he collected social contacts of other kinds, for the pleasure of their company, for the ways in which they reflected well on him in the social environments where he moved, for the fact that beautiful young women were, in the milieu he inhabited, a form of social currency whose value he understood with great precision. He invited Christine to visit his flat at 17 Wimpole Mews, a Mews property in Marylebone that was itself a statement of Ward's particular position. Mews properties in that part of London were not grand, but they were not inexpensive either, and the address carried with it a certain quality of understated refinement that suited his carefully constructed image. The flat was full of his sketches, his books, his records, the accumulated evidence of a man who had built his life around the cultivation of aesthetic pleasure and social connection. He introduced her to his friends, who were not the kind of friends that a girl from a railway carriage in Wraysbury could have expected to encounter in any ordinary trajectory of her life. What followed was not a romance in any straightforward sense. It was something more like a transformation, the beginning of an education in a world that Christine had always known existed and had never expected to enter. Ward was the tutor. The establishment of England was the curriculum. And the full cost of that education would not become clear until it was far too late to drop the course. To understand what happened in the summer of 1961, you first have to understand Stephen Ward properly, not as the newspapers would later draw him and not as the prosecution would later present him, but as the man he actually was in the years before the story turned against him. Because Ward was genuinely complicated, and complicated men are the kind that simple narratives struggle to contain. He was born in October of 1912 in Leamington Spa, the son of a Church of England clergyman. The background was respectable, educated, and utterly middle class, which is to say that it was a background that gave him the accent and the manners of the class above him without giving him the means. He had grown up around a certain kind of Englishness, the Englishness of country rectories and public school values and the assumption that life was meant to be lived with a certain standard of dignity and aesthetic engagement, and he had absorbed all of it with great skill while understanding, with equal clarity, that the social elevator that would have carried a wealthier man upward was not simply going to arrive for him on its own. What Ward did instead was build his own version of access. He trained as an osteopath after the Second World War, having spent the war years in various roles that honed his understanding of both human anatomy and human psychology. He established his practice in Devonshire Street, in the comfortable heart of London's medical district, and he proved to be genuinely gifted at his work. His hands were dexterous and perceptive. He could find the source of a patient's pain with a diagnostic precision that impressed even those who had approached osteopathy with skepticism. But what distinguished him from other skilled osteopaths was not merely the quality of his hands. It was the quality of his attention. Ward listened in the consulting room. He listened in that particular way that makes people feel heard in a manner they cannot always articulate, with his full presence, with an apparent absence of judgment, with the rare capacity to absorb what someone was saying without visibly calculating his response. Pain makes people honest. Anyone who has ever been in serious physical discomfort knows that the defenses come down, that the social performance temporarily suspends itself, and that the person lying on the treatment bed is likely to say things that the upright, dressed, public version of themselves might not say. Ward understood this dynamic completely and used it with a naturalness that never felt manipulative in the moment, even if its long-term effects were undeniably useful to him. His patients became his friends, and his friends were extraordinary. By the late 1950s, the list of people who had passed through Ward's consulting room and subsequently entered his social orbit was genuinely remarkable. Lord Astor was among them, William Waldorf Astor, the 3rd Viscount Astor, one of the wealthiest men in England and the owner of Cliveden, the great house in Buckinghamshire that had for decades served as a salon for the powerful and the influential. Astor valued Ward's professional skills and liked his company, and in a gesture of generous eccentricity that Ward would have calculated as useful from the moment it was offered, had given Ward the use of a cottage on the Cliveden estate. Ward lived there on weekends, and the cottage became a kind of annex to the main house, a place where the slightly more relaxed margins of the Cliveden social world could be played out. Through Astor, Ward knew other aristocrats. Through the consulting room, he knew politicians and military men. Through his portrait work, for the sketches were genuinely good, and he was, in the late 1950s, exhibiting and selling them with some success, he had connections in the art world and in the press. He had drawn Winston Churchill and members of the royal family, and numerous figures from the higher reaches of public life. The act of drawing someone is intimate in its own way. You spend hours studying a face, watching how the features settle, observing the expressions that appear between the posed moments, and Ward used this intimacy with the same easy skill he used the consulting bed. He was not homosexual, not primarily, though he was comfortable in a variety of social environments that the more rigidly conventional of his contemporaries might have found uncomfortable. His specific attraction was to young women, but his relationship with them was never simple, and this is where the story of his character becomes genuinely difficult to assess cleanly. He collected young women in the way he collected everything else, with genuine affection, with the pleasure of their company, and with an awareness of their social utility that he would never have described so baldly. He introduced them to wealthy and powerful men. He provided them with access to a world they could not have entered otherwise. And in exchange, he received something that is harder to define, a sense of centrality, of being the necessary node through which certain kinds of social energy flowed. Whether this arrangement constituted exploitation is a question the people involved answered differently. Christine Keeler, in her later years, was unambiguous about what she felt she had been. A young woman used and then discarded by a man who had understood her vulnerability from the beginning and had found it convenient rather than troubling. Others who knew Ward characterized the relationship differently, insisting that he was genuinely fond of the women in his circle and genuinely concerned for their welfare. The truth is probably more uncomfortable than either of these positions, which is that both things can be simultaneously true, that Ward was fond of Christine and that he used her, and that his fondness made the using easier to accomplish rather than rendering it innocent. At the Wimpole Mews flat in the early months of their acquaintance, Christine was absorbing an education. She met Ward's friends. She attended his parties. She was introduced to the language of the world he inhabited, not the explicit vocabulary of power, but the subtler grammar of how power dressed itself, how it moved through rooms, what it valued in conversation and what it dismissed as vulgar or naive. Ward was an extraordinary teacher in this regard, not because he sat Christine down and explained things, but because she was intelligent enough and observant enough to learn by watching him operate. She also met, during this period, another young woman who would become central to the story that was to come. Mandy Rice Davies was 16 years old when she and Christine met. Blonde where Christine was dark, bolder in some registers though equally young and equally removed from the world she was entering. Mandy had come to London from the Midlands with a similar quality of determination and a similar gap between her background and her ambitions. The two young women became something like friends, though their relationship was always shaped by the particular dynamics of their shared circumstances. They were both around Ward, both being drawn into his world, both navigating the same complex territory with the different instincts that their different personalities produced. Ward's world was not simply the world of the wealthy and the powerful. It also included, and this is the Cold War dimension that would later make the whole affair something more than a sex scandal, representatives of the Soviet Union. Ward had an interest in international affairs that expressed itself partly as genuine intellectual curiosity and partly as a taste for the exotic. The sense that knowing people from the enemy camp was evidence of his special position, his ability to move where others could not. He had met, through various connections, a number of Soviet officials who were posted to London in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and he cultivated these connections with the same energy he brought to his other social activities. It was through this channel that he had come to know Captain Yevgeny Ivanov, the the Soviet naval attaché in London. But Ivanov comes later. What matters at this point in the story is the geography of Ward's world. The fact that it was simultaneously anchored in the highest levels of the British establishment and connected to the embassies and representatives of the Soviet state, and that Stephen Ward himself stood at the barely visible intersection of those two circles, serving both sides without quite fully belonging to either. What MI5, the British Domestic Intelligence Service, made of Stephen Ward was something that took time to crystallize but that eventually resolved into a recognition of his unique utility. The security service was aware of him. It had files on him. It understood that he was a social operator who moved across lines that most people respected, and that this movement made him both a potential source of information and a potential source of risk. The relationship between MI5 and Ward would, in later years, become one of the most hotly contested aspects of the entire affair, with Ward claiming that he had acted as an informant for the security service and the security service declining to confirm or deny anything in its characteristic fashion. But this is for later. In 1959 and 1960, what Christine knew was simply that her life had changed. She was living, part of the time at least, at Wimpole Mews. She was moving in circles that would have been entirely inaccessible to her from the railway carriage in Wraysbury. She was wearing better clothes, eating better food, and finding herself in rooms where the conversation was of a different quality than anything she had previously encountered. The price of this entry into the privileged world was one she had not yet fully computed, because the billing had not yet arrived. Ward was building toward something. He always was. His world required constant tending, constant new introductions and new connections and new elements that would keep the whole structure interesting and alive. He had the cottage at Cliveden. He had Lord Astor's friendship. He had his patients and his portraits and his parties. And he had Christine, who was becoming, in his estimation, exactly the kind of young woman who would fit very naturally into the specific social world that the summer weekends at Cliveden represented. He had her take driving lessons. He encouraged her to read. He commented on her appearance with the proprietorial interest of a man who had invested something in her presentation to the world. He was, in the vocabulary that his era provided, making her into a certain kind of social ornament. And in the summer of 1961, he was going to show her off at the most significant address in his social calendar. All the pieces were now in position. The man from the Berkshire Railway carriage and the man from the War Office were about to occupy the same swimming pool. History, in its dry and ironic fashion, was about to make a note. Cliveden sits above the Thames in Buckinghamshire, approximately 25 miles west of London, and there is a particular kind of English light in the late afternoon of a summer day that falls across its terraces in a way that seems almost designed to make the rest of the country feel like a rough draft. The main house stands at the top of a chalk cliff that drops 200 feet to the river, commanding a view that has changed very little in the centuries since the estate was first laid out, the water moving through its flat meadows below with the unhurried permanence of something that has always been there and intends to remain. The formal gardens roll away from the house in geometrically precise arrangements of box hedging and seasonal planting, giving way to parkland that stretches for 376 acres in every direction, punctuated by woodland and by the kind of elaborate garden ornaments that only estates of this scale can absorb without looking cluttered. It is, by any measure, one of the great houses of England. It has been rebuilt and enlarged and remodeled across several centuries, arriving at its current form, the Italianate palace designed by Charles Barry in the 1850s, through a succession of owners who include a duke, an earl, and the Astor family, who acquired it in 1893 and under whose ownership it became one of the defining social venues of the 20th century. The phrase, the Cliveden set, had entered the political vocabulary of the 1930s as a description of the influential group who gathered at the house around Nancy Astor, the first woman to take her seat in the House of Commons, and whose conversations about foreign policy were thought by their critics to have shaped, and in some readings catastrophically misshapen, British attitudes toward German rearmament in the years before the Second World War. Whether that critique was fair is a matter of ongoing historical dispute. What is not disputed is that Cliveden, for decades, had been a place where the social and the political were deliberately and systematically mixed in ways that gave it an influence quite different from anything that a mere country house, however grand, might otherwise possess. By 1961, the house was occupied by Lord Astor, William Waldorf Astor, the third Viscount, who had inherited both the property and the family's tradition of grand entertainment when his famous mother died in 1964. He was a less dramatic figure than Nancy, a quieter man, but he maintained the house and its social function with genuine commitment. The weekends at Cliveden in the early 1960s were not identical to the political salon of the pre-war years. The world was different, and so was the nature of the gathering, but they retained something of the essential quality of the institution. The sense that in coming here, in accepting the invitation and making the drive from London, you were entering a space where the normal rules of social stratification were gently dissolved and replaced by something more fluid, where the duke and the diplomat and the journalist and the artist might all find themselves beside each other on the terrace with a drink, and where the conversation that resulted might matter in ways that could not always be predicted in advance. Ward's cottage on the estate was called Spring Cottage, and it sat at the edge of the grounds at some distance from the main house, close to the river path that wound along the water's edge. It was not grand, a modest structure, comfortable rather than impressive, but its location gave it a particular quality of its own, the sense of being adjacent to greatness without being overwhelmed by it. Ward used it as his retreat on weekends, bringing with him the combination of social energy and personal ease that made him such a consistent pleasure to have around, and populating it with the friends and acquaintances whose company formed the constant traffic of his life. The swimming pool at Cliveden was a later addition to the estate, constructed in the 1920s, a long rectangular pool set into a terrace below the formal gardens, enclosed by walls and hedges that gave it a quality of seclusion without entirely separating it from the landscape around it. In summer, it was a gathering point for the guests, a place where the English party relocated itself for the afternoon, where the conversation continued in a more informal register, where the usual protocols of the house relaxed themselves under the influence of warm weather and the specific freedom that water provides to social occasions. People who would never dream of appearing publicly in a state of undress shed their careful presentation beside a swimming pool with a naturalness that the Victorians had made impossible and that the mid-20th century was only just beginning to reclaim. Ward brought a party to Spring Cottage on the weekend of July 8, 1961. Among them were several friends whose names are not historically significant, and a 19-year-old woman from Berkshire named Christine Keeler, who had been part of his social world for the better part of 2 years and who was, in the way of young women in Ward's orbit, simultaneously a genuine part of the gathering and a specific kind of ornament to it. Lord Astor's weekend party at the main house included, as it often did, representatives from various branches of public life. Among the guests that weekend was John Dennis Profumo Jack, to those who knew him, who was at that moment serving in Harold Macmillan's conservative government as Secretary of State for War. He had come with his wife, the actress Valerie Hobson, and they occupied the position of distinguished guests that a property like Cliveden regularly accumulated by simple virtue of its reputation and its owner's connections. Profumo was 46 years old, at what appeared to be the peak of a career that had unfolded with the steady upward trajectory of a man who had cultivated the right relationships and made the right marriages and aligned himself with the right institutions. The two parties, the house party and the cottage party, as often happened at Cliveden, converged in the late afternoon around the swimming pool. This was not unusual. The geography of the estate encouraged it, and Ward's presence in the cottage was sufficiently familiar that the social logic of the two groups coming together had the naturalness of long habit. What was unusual was what happened when the great and the good of Macmillan's government came around the corner of the hedge and found, swimming in the pool, a 19-year-old girl who was not wearing any clothes. This is one of the most replayed scenes in the entire history of the affair, repeated in newspaper accounts and books and films and television programs until its particulars have acquired the polished, slightly legendary quality of events that have been narrated so many times they begin to feel cinematographic rather than merely real. But what actually happened, stripped of the overlay of subsequent narration, was straightforward enough. Christine had been swimming. She was 19 years old and comfortable with her body in the way that Ward's world, with its looseness about social convention, had encouraged. She climbed out of the pool without a swimsuit, and at approximately this moment, Lord Astor and his house guests, including John Profumo, came around the corner of the poolside hedge. What followed was a brief moment of confusion and laughter. Christine retreating toward Ward, someone throwing a towel, the English instinct for converting embarrassment into comedy asserting itself with its characteristic speed. The incident was small in its immediate dimensions. Nobody behaved badly. Profumo was introduced to Christine. Pleasantries were exchanged. The awkwardness dissolved into the relaxed atmosphere of a summer weekend at a grand house, where such moments were absorbed without excessive ceremony. But something had been registered. Profumo noticed Christine with the attention of a man who had not expected to notice anyone that evening and who found, to his own surprise, that he could not entirely stop noticing. This was not, on its own, remarkable. He was an attractive man of middle age at the height of his power, and she was a very beautiful young woman, and the pool and the summer evening and the particular looseness of the atmosphere were all doing precisely the work that summer evenings at grand houses have always done. But the noticing, which might have ended there, did not quite end there. Ward, who missed nothing, observed the dynamic with the quiet precision of a man who understood the value of what he was watching. He was not plotting. It would be too deliberate to say he was plotting. But he was aware, and his awareness was of the kind that stored information rather than discarding it. Ward's entire social world was built on the principle that connections had value, that an introduction made under the right circumstances could generate outcomes of various kinds, not all of which were predictable in advance. The weekend passed. The house party from Cliveden returned to London. John Profumo had been introduced to Christine Keeler beside a swimming pool on a summer evening, and that introduction had lodged itself somewhere in his thinking in a way that the ordinary social encounter would not usually warrant. He was a married man. He was a cabinet minister. He was, by every conventional measure, in a position where prudence was not merely advisable but professionally essential. The Cold War was at one of its most dangerous moments. The security services were active. The press was watchful. None of this, as it turned out, would be sufficient. The summer of 1961 was also the summer of the Berlin Wall. Construction began on August 13th, just 5 weeks after the Cliveden weekend, and the summer of the ongoing crisis over nuclear weapons testing and the unresolved tensions between East and West that made every week feel like a prelude to something catastrophic. The world that John Profumo inhabited professionally was one of extreme geopolitical tension. Meetings with NATO allies, discussions about Britain's nuclear deterrent, assessments of Soviet military capability. He carried classified information about the security of the Western Alliance. And yet here he was, at a swimming pool in Buckinghamshire, having been irrevocably noticed by a 19-year-old from Wraysbury, and having irrevocably noticed her back. The consequences of that mutual noticing were going to take 2 years to fully unfold. But from this weekend, the clock was running. The first contact came through Ward, as almost everything in Christine's world came through Ward. In the days following the Cliveden weekend, Profumo asked Ward for Christine's telephone number. The request was casual and was presented as such, the kind of social follow-up that is common after a pleasant evening, the kind of connection that an extrovert makes naturally without necessarily intending more by it than the words themselves suggest. Ward gave him the number. Whether Ward understood at that moment what he was facilitating, or whether he had already understood it and was facilitating it deliberately, is a question that different accounts of the affair answer differently, and the truth is probably that Ward understood it very well and saw no compelling reason to refuse. Profumo called. Christine took the call. He was charming in the way that politicians are trained to be charming. Attentive, warm, with the quality of focused interest that power bestows on those who are used to having rooms orient themselves around them. He knew how to make someone feel that they were the most interesting person in whatever conversation he happened to be having, and this is not a small gift, particularly when deployed on a 19-year-old girl who had grown up in a railway carriage in Berkshire and who was still, in some fundamental sense, amazed to be in the rooms she was now occupying. The affair began in July of 1961, weeks after Cliveden. He came to the flat at Wimpole Mews. Ward was away, or discreetly occupied otherwise, and the geography of the arrangement allowed for a privacy that both parties needed. He came several times, and the pattern established itself with the particular logic of these relationships. The scheduled visits, the phone calls in between, the careful management of time so that the world around each of them continued to believe that things were as they had been before. Christine was not in love with Profumo, or at least not in the way that the word is usually deployed. She liked him. He was good company, generous, attentive. He brought her small gifts, a cigarette lighter once, and treated her with a kind of warmth that she found genuinely pleasant. But she was also 19 years old and he was 46, and the gap between those numbers was not simply a gap in years but a gap in circumstances, in resources, in power, in options. He had everything. She had access to a world that was his by birthright and hers only by association. The affair was not equal, and she understood this, and it gave the whole experience a quality of unreality, the sense of being a temporary visitor to something she had not been issued a permanent pass for. What Profumo felt is harder to assess with confidence, as it always is when the historical record consists primarily of the accounts of people whose interests were served by particular versions of the story. His later testimony, and the conduct he displayed throughout the affair and its aftermath, suggest a man who was genuinely attracted to Christine, and who allowed that attraction to override the very considerable intelligence that his career had required him to develop. He was not a stupid man. He was not an inattentive one. He had been around power long enough to understand that its fruits could be withdrawn as quickly as they had been bestowed. And yet he allowed himself an indiscretion that even a moderately cautious person in considerably lower public office would have recognized as dangerous. There is a particular kind of arrogance that comes with sustained success in public life, not the crude arrogance of the insecure, but a subtler quality, almost a sensory dulling, in which the exceptional accumulation of privilege and influence begins to feel like the natural order of things rather than a specific set of circumstances that could be unmade by specific events. Men who have been protected by their position for long enough begin, in some wordless way, to believe in the invulnerability that their position appears to confer. Profumo was, by 1961, deep in that territory. He sent Christine letters during the course of the affair. This was a catastrophic error of judgment, though it did not become a catastrophic error of judgment in practice until much later. The notes were short and informal, neither explicitly incriminating in their content nor prudently vague in their implications. One of them, addressed to Christine in the diminutive form of her name, has survived in the historical record and was central to the subsequent exposure of the affair. It was signed J, a gesture toward plausible deniability that would, when the time came, provide no deniability whatsoever. The affair lasted, in its active phase, from approximately July 1961 until late that year or very early 1962. Various accounts differ on the precise dating, but the documented evidence points to a relationship that was intense in its early weeks and then attenuated as the practical difficulties of maintaining it began to accumulate. These were not the difficulties of detection had not yet arrived, but the ordinary difficulties of any secret relationship, the logistics of time and discretion, the way that regular contact in private requires a level of sustained organization that eventually either becomes a parallel life or collapses under its own weight. Profumo was a busy man. His ministerial responsibilities were genuine and demanding. The War Office in the early 1960s was an institution deeply engaged with the central problems of British defense policy. The question of where Britain sat in the NATO alliance, the proper disposition of British forces in Germany, the ongoing assessment of Soviet military capability, the complex negotiations around nuclear weapons that occupied every Western defense minister in this period. These were not routine occupations. They required his presence, his attention, and a security consciousness that his department enforced with considerable rigor. He was also married, and his marriage was not a mere formality. Valerie Hobson had been one of the most celebrated British actresses of the 1940s, appearing in films that had made her famous before she retired from the screen in 1954 to concentrate on her role as a politician's wife. She was intelligent, genuinely accomplished, and by survivors' accounts a woman of real grace and personal dignity, someone who had chosen to support her husband's career with a commitment that made the revelation of his affair a genuinely devastating betrayal rather than the polite uncoupling of a purely convenient arrangement. Profumo presumably knew all of this. And presumably, the knowing did not make a sufficient difference. The flat at Wimpole Mews that provided the setting for the relationship had its own complications. Ward was there or nearby, and Ward was not the only complication that attached to Ward's world. Also present in that world, at exactly this moment, was a man whose presence at the intersection of Christine's life and Profumo's life was not merely personally inconvenient but geopolitically alarming. Captain Yevgeny Ivanov, the Soviet naval attaché, was also sleeping with Christine Keeler at approximately the same time as John Profumo. This fact, when it eventually became known, transformed what might otherwise have been an embarrassing but politically manageable personal scandal into something of an entirely different order. A security matter, a Cold War incident, a case in which the Secretary of State for War had been sharing a lover with a Soviet intelligence officer at the most tense moment of the nuclear standoff between East and West. Whether any actual intelligence was compromised is a question that the official investigations would spend a great deal of energy examining and ultimately answering with considerable qualification. But the question had to be asked, and the asking of it was enough to make the Profumo affair something that the newspapers, when they eventually found their footing, could pursue not merely as a story of sexual hypocrisy but as a story of national security. For now, though, it was still a secret. The summer of 1961 receded into autumn. The visits to Wimpole Mews thinned and stopped. Profumo and Christine ceased to meet in the way they had been meeting, and both of them moved forward with their respective lives in a manner that suggested the whole episode might simply be absorbed by time, filed away under the category of things that happened and then did not happen anymore. That is not what occurred. Things that involve power and vulnerability and secrecy have a particular persistence. They do not simply dissolve when the parties involved cease to be in active contact. They leave behind notes and drawers, stories told in confidence to friends, accounts that shift and alter as they move from person to person. They leave behind the specific knowledge of the woman who was in the room, who can be silenced or managed or marginalized but who cannot be entirely unmade, because she exists and she knows what she knows. Christine Keeler knew what she knew. She was 19 years old, and she had been sleeping with a cabinet minister and a Soviet naval attaché in the same weeks, in rooms arranged by a man who had connections to the British Security Service, in a flat that was part of a world that the English establishment had constructed with great care for purposes that were precisely the opposite of honest reckoning. She was not yet a problem. She was not yet a scandal. She had not yet decided or been forced to decide what to do with what she knew. But she was a fuse, and fuses, given enough time, eventually find a flame. John Dennis Profumo was born on January 30th, 1915, into a family whose wealth derived from Italian insurance interests and whose social position in England was that of the comfortably established upper middle class, the layer of English society that sends its sons to the right schools, owns the right kind of country property, and moves with the natural ease of people who have never been required to consider money as an obstacle to anything they wanted. His father was a baron of the Kingdom of Italy, a title that sat slightly oddly on the English social landscape but carried with it the suggestion of continental sophistication that gave the family a particular kind of distinction. He was educated at Harrow, that great engine of the English establishment which had produced, among its alumni, Winston Churchill, countless statesmen, and an uncountable number of men whose names appeared in the better drawing rooms of the country without anyone needing to explain why. From Harrow he went to Brasenose College, Oxford, where he read law, though the law was always, in his case, more of a credential than a vocation, and where he moved into the social world of the university with the ease of a man who had been prepared for it by every aspect of his previous formation. He entered politics in 1940, at the age of 25, winning the seat of Kettering in Northamptonshire as a Conservative Member of Parliament, which made him one of the youngest MPs in the House at the time of his election. This was remarkable not simply for its timing but for its circumstance. He was elected in the middle of the war, in a country whose political life had been suspended into the careful coalition of national emergency, and where the normal business of Westminster had been replaced by something more like the management of survival. He had joined the army before his election, serving in the Queen's Own Royal West Kent Regiment and later with forces in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, rising to the rank of brigadier and earning decorations for his service. He returned from the war with a combination of credentials that was, in the Conservative Party of the late 1940s and the 1950s, almost ideal for the trajectory that followed. He was brave, he had served well in combat. He was polished. His background and his education had produced the kind of social confidence that plays well in Westminster. He was ambitious. From his earliest days in the House, he was identified by those around him as a man who was going somewhere, who would require watching, who had the instincts of a future minister. He was, in the vocabulary that British politics uses for such people, a comer. His marriage in 1954 to Valerie Hobson added a further dimension to an already distinguished public image. Hobson had been one of the great British screen actresses of the late 1930s and 1940s, a woman whose films had made her a genuinely popular figure, whose face was known to the public in a way that politicians' wives were not ordinarily known. She had appeared in pictures of considerable reputation, working alongside actors of the first rank, and her decision to retire from the screen on her marriage was read by the press of the day as a romantic sacrifice, the gifted woman choosing love and public duty over personal achievement. It was the kind of story that the 1950s particularly approved of, and it attached itself to Profumo's public image as a further ornament, one that suggested the man was lucky in his personal life as well as his professional one. Through the late 1950s, he rose steadily through the ministerial ladder. He served as parliamentary secretary at the Colonial Office. He was parliamentary undersecretary of state for foreign affairs. By 1960, Harold Macmillan had appointed him Secretary of State for War, a full cabinet position, a seat at the most senior table, a role that placed him at the center of the decisions about Britain's military posture in the most dangerous decade of the Cold War. He was 45 years old, admired by colleagues, respected by the military establishment, and married to a woman whom the country regarded with genuine warmth. It is worth dwelling on this portrait of Profumo's public life, because the contrast between that portrait and the events that were simultaneously unfolding on his behalf at Wimpole Mews is the engine of the whole story. The Profumo affair was not simply a story about a man who had an affair. It was a story about the gap between the England that publicly presented itself, the England of responsible statesmanship, of public service, of social order maintained by the discretion and self-discipline of those in authority, and the England that actually existed behind the curtain, where the conventions were entirely different, where the rules that applied to ordinary people did not apply with the same rigor to those who occupied the right postcode and attended the right weekends. Profumo in the War Office was handling intelligence. This is the dimension of the story that the people who lived through it found hardest to dismiss as merely personal, and that the subsequent official investigations were required to address with the greatest care. The Secretary of State for War received classified assessments of Soviet military capability. He had access to information about NATO's nuclear posture, about the disposition of British forces in Germany, about the deliberations of the Western Alliance at a moment when the Cuban Missile Crisis was less than a year away and the Berlin situation was at its most acute. This was not abstract or hypothetical sensitivity. This was genuine operational intelligence. And while he was in possession of this intelligence, he was meeting, in a flat in Marylebone, a young woman who was also meeting a Soviet naval attaché. The security services would eventually interview Profumo about the extent to which his relationship with Christine had exposed any classified information. His position, firmly maintained, was that he had never discussed anything of a classified nature with her, that the relationship had been conducted entirely in personal terms, and that no intelligence breach had occurred. The official Denning report, which Harold Macmillan commissioned in the aftermath of the scandal, arrived at a qualified conclusion: that there was no evidence that any specific classified information had been compromised as a direct result of the affair. But the Denning report was careful to note that absence of evidence of a breach was not the same as certainty that no breach had occurred. The intelligence investigation was conducted under the significant handicap that most of the people whose accounts were needed had strong reasons to present those accounts in the most favorable light available to them. Christine Keeler was not a trained intelligence asset. She was not conducting a deliberate operation designed to extract information through a honey trap. But she existed at the nexus of two men, one British and one Soviet, whose respective positions made the coincidence alarming regardless of whether any explicit exchange had taken place. The Soviet naval attaché's name was Captain Yevgeny Ivanov, and his presence in this story is not incidental. He was an officer of the GRU Soviet military intelligence, operating under diplomatic cover in London, and his assignment in the United Kingdom during the early 1960s included the cultivation of British politicians and officials through the kind of informal social contact that intelligence services on both sides of the Cold War routinely used as a tool. He was good-looking, educated, charming in a way that English people of that period sometimes found less oppressive than Soviet propaganda would have led them to expect. He drank well and told good stories and moved in Stephen Ward's social circle with the particular comfort of someone who had been carefully prepared for exactly this kind of environment. Profumo knew none of this yet. Or rather, he would claim later that he had known nothing of the Ivanov connection when the affair with Christine began, which is possibly true, though the waters here are muddied by the fact that Ward himself had connections to both men and must, on some level, have been aware of the double coincidence. What Profumo was processing in the months following the Cliveden weekend and the visits to Wimpole Mews was not a security calculation but a far more familiar human experience. The process of returning to ordinary life after stepping briefly outside it, the quiet management of the distance between what he had done and who he was publicly required to be. He was Secretary of State for War. He sat in cabinet. He went to the House of Commons and stood at the dispatch box and answered questions about defense policy with the measured authority that his position conferred. He dined at the right tables and attended the right functions and treated Valerie with a propriety that, from any external vantage, would have given no indication of anything untoward. The two halves of his life were running in parallel, and he believed, as people in this situation typically believe, that the parallel track was safely enclosed, that the walls between his public world and his private one were robust enough to prevent any contamination in either direction. He was managing it. He had always managed things. He had built a career on the management of complex situations and the confident navigation of institutional demands. This was simply another management problem, and he was equal to it. He was not equal to it. He had never been equal to it because the premise on which his confidence rested, the premise that his position conferred a protection from consequence that other men did not possess, was in the process of being tested by circumstances that his position had no actual power over. Christine Keeler was not a civil servant bound by the Official Secrets Act. Wimpole Mews was not a government building. Stephen Ward's social world operated by its own rules, and those rules, as Profumo was about to discover with great slowness and then terrible speed, did not include a provision for protecting the reputation of cabinet ministers who had been indiscreet in the summer of 1961. The autumn passed. The winter came and went. 1962 arrived, and with it the quiet accumulation of all the things that had been set in motion by a summer evening at a swimming pool, finding their positions, waiting for the moment when they would make themselves known. The Soviet embassy in London in the early 1960s occupied a building in Kensington Palace Gardens, that wide, tree-lined private road in West London sometimes called Millionaire's Row, where the ambassadorial residences of various nations stood in the particular kind of guarded grandeur that diplomatic property always achieves, their facades giving nothing away about the activities conducted behind them. The GRU, Soviet military intelligence, operated alongside the KGB within the embassy structure, with a degree of inter-service rivalry that mirrored, in its own way, the competition between MI5 and MI6 on the British side. Intelligence operations between the two blocks in London were conducted at a level of intensity that the general public of the early 1960s only dimly perceived, despite the spy scandals that had been appearing in the newspapers with regular enough frequency to suggest that the capital was seriously compromised. The previous year had brought the arrest of George Blake, the MI6 officer who had been revealed as a Soviet agent and who was sentenced in May 1961 to what was then the longest custodial sentence ever handed down by a British court, 42 years. Before Blake, there had been Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean, who had fled to Moscow in 1951, and the ongoing investigation into the network of which they had been part. And there was the Vassal case, which was in the midst of unfolding as the Profumo affair was simultaneously building toward its own exposure. John Vassal, an Admiralty clerk who had been blackmailed by the KGB into passing naval secrets for years before his arrest in 1962. The British security establishment was in a state of sustained anxiety about the depth to which Soviet intelligence had penetrated its ranks, and that anxiety made the Profumo situation, when it eventually became known, something that could not be assessed in isolation from everything else that had been happening. Into this environment came Captain Yevgeny Ivanov, who took up his posting as Soviet naval attaché in London in March 1960. He was 37 years old, strongly built, with the confident bearing and the easy social manner that suggested a man who had been specifically selected and prepared for the kind of work that his posting in London required. His English was good. His ability to move in English social environments was genuine. He was not the crude propagandist of the Western imagination but a sophisticated operator who understood that the most useful relationships were built through genuine warmth and shared interests rather than through pressure or inducement. Ward had met Ivanov through a contact at the Soviet embassy sometime in 1960, and the two men had developed what all accounts describe as a genuine friendship, or at least a relationship that, from the outside, could not easily be distinguished from genuine friendship. They played golf together. They socialized in the same circles. Ward, with his characteristic instinct for cultivating connections across social and political lines, found Ivanov interesting in the way he found all unusual people interesting, as someone whose presence in his world added a dimension that most people around him lacked. But the relationship between Ward and Ivanov was not simply a personal one, and here the account becomes genuinely murky in ways that have never been entirely resolved. Ward later claimed, and this claim was made by him consistently and with some force, that MI5 had asked him to cultivate Ivanov as a source of intelligence. He said that he had been approached by an MI5 officer named Keith Wagstaff, who asked him to use his friendship with Ivanov to gather information about Soviet intentions, possibly including Ivanov's assessment of Russian military policy during the Berlin crisis. Ward said that he had agreed to this, that he had accordingly maintained and deepened his relationship with Ivanov in service of what he understood to be a British intelligence operation, and that his subsequent position as a man caught between the Soviet naval attaché and the Secretary of State for War needed to be understood within this operational context. MI5's public response to these claims was the institutional equivalent of a closed file. The security service neither confirmed nor denied Ward's account in any official statement, and its former officers were predictably circumspect on the subject for decades afterward. The Denning report, which investigated the whole affair comprehensively, found that Ward had indeed made contact with MI5 and had been in communication with the security service, but assessed that his role had been that of an informal and not entirely reliable informant rather than a formally run agent. Whether Ward was telling the truth, partially telling the truth, or constructing a defensive narrative in the face of prosecution is something the available evidence does not resolve with certainty. What is clear is that he had a documented relationship with MI5. What is also clear is that MI5 was well aware of his connection to both Ivanov and Profumo from a relatively early stage, and that the security service's response to this awareness was characterized more by institutional caution than by decisive action. Ivanov, for his part, was conducting himself in exactly the way that a Soviet intelligence officer posted to the enemy capital was supposed to conduct himself, building relationships, gathering information on the social and political landscape, identifying potential vulnerabilities in the British establishment that might be exploited, and reporting his assessments back to Moscow in the diplomatic cables that passed through the embassy. Whether his relationship with Christine Keeler was a deliberate intelligence operation or a personal indulgence that ran alongside his professional duties is another of the questions that the surviving records do not answer with the clarity that subsequent investigators have sought. What is not in question is that Christine was sleeping with both men. She has said so herself in multiple accounts across the decades that followed. She was not concealing this fact in the way that the two men were concealing their respective involvements from the world. She was a 19-year-old girl moving through a social world that was not hers by right and that had been offered to her on terms whose full complexity she was still in the process of understanding. The men in her life were not honest with her about who they were or what they represented, and she, in turn, was not in a position to understand the significance of the specific intersection that her life had become. The question of whether Ivanov attempted to gather intelligence through Christine, the specific allegation that Ward had at some point asked Christine to try to discover from Profumo information about nuclear weapons in West Germany, is one of the most persistently disputed claims in the entire affair. Christine's accounts of this have varied somewhat over the years. In some versions, she recalls Ward raising the subject with her, asking her to pass a question to Profumo. In other versions, the conversation was far more casual, a passing remark rather than an explicit request. Profumo consistently denied that any classified information had ever been discussed. The Denning report found insufficient evidence to conclude that any intelligence operation against Profumo had been successfully run through Christine. But the question itself, the possibility that the Secretary of State for War was being targeted by Soviet intelligence through a lover supplied by a man connected to MI5, in a flat that both men frequented, was exactly the kind of question that the security services existed to prevent from arising. And the fact that it had arisen, that it was now possible to ask it and to find it worth asking, was itself a measure of how badly the oversight mechanisms of the British intelligence community had functioned. MI5 had known about the Profumo-Christine connection by the autumn of 1961 at the latest. The security service had been informed, through Ward himself or through surveillance of Ward, that the relationship existed. What it did with this information is the question. The answer, in the characteristically understated fashion of official Britain, is not very much and not very quickly. Roger Hollis, the Director General of MI5, was aware of the situation. Hollis himself was a figure who would later attract his own cloud of accusation. There would be allegations, never proved and never disproved to universal satisfaction, that Hollis himself had been a Soviet agent, the most senior penetration of British intelligence in history. These allegations have been examined by subsequent investigations and have been found and proven, though they have not been entirely extinguished. What is not alleged is that Hollis acted decisively in the matter of Profumo. The evidence suggests the opposite, that the security service identified the problem, assessed it cautiously, and chose to alert the political authorities through channels that relied on those authorities acting on what they were told. In the summer and early autumn of 1961, an MI5 officer conveyed to the Cabinet Secretary, Sir Norman Brooke, the information that Ivanov was a GRU officer and that he was known to be in contact with Ward and, through Ward, with Christine. This was the security service discharging its duty to inform. What happened next was the Cabinet Secretary's responsibility, and the Cabinet Secretary's response was to convey, through the government chief whip, a warning to Profumo that his acquaintance with Miss Keeler should be brought to an end. It is worth pausing to appreciate the extraordinary gentleness of this intervention. The man who was simultaneously the Secretary of State for War and a person sharing a lover with a GRU officer was not interviewed, not investigated, not required to account for himself in any formal sense. He was, through the medium of the Chief Whip's office, quietly advised that the acquaintance should cease. The affair by this point had already effectively ended of its own accord, so the warning arrived as a formality rather than a revelation. But the manner of its delivery speaks to something fundamental about the way the British establishment of this period dealt with its own transgressions, with a softness, a discretion, a preference for the quiet word over the formal mechanism, that reflected both its genuine cohesion and its profound inability to regulate itself honestly. The warning was given. Profumo acknowledged it. The affair was over in its active phase. And the security service moved on to other concerns, apparently satisfied that the matter had been handled. It had not been handled. It had been postponed. The year 1962 was, by the measures that mattered most in the world of international relations, one of the most dangerous 12 months of the 20th century. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October detonated at the edges of nuclear catastrophe and receded, leaving behind the particular kind of relief that makes people briefly grateful for the ordinary passage of days. The Berlin Wall had gone up in August of the previous year, and its concrete presence was a daily reminder that the world had divided itself into two armed camps, between which the distance was simultaneously enormous and terrifyingly small. The test ban treaty that would eventually limit the atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons was still being negotiated. Britain's independent nuclear deterrent was a live political question. Every briefing that crossed the desk of the Secretary of State for War carried with it the weight of potential annihilation. For John Profumo, the year unfolded in the demanding normality of ministerial life. He attended cabinet meetings and gave speeches and appeared at formal functions and managed the considerable business of his department with the competence that his colleagues had always attributed to him. He had received the quiet word through the chief whip's office. He had ceased his visits to Wimpole Mews. The connection with Christine Keeler had, in his accounting, been closed out. For Christine, the year unfolded very differently. She was 20 years old, living in Ward's world, without the kind of independent resources that might have allowed her to step back from the environment that was producing the pressure in her life. She was beautiful and known to be beautiful, and this was, as it had always been, both a door and a trap. It opened access to things she could not have reached otherwise. But it did so on terms that others set, and those terms were not negotiated from any platform of equality. She had, during and after the Profumo interlude, continued to circulate in the social world that Ward maintained. And that world, loosely defined, included men of very different kinds. Peter Rackman was one of them, a property developer of considerable notoriety whose name had become, in the vocabulary of 1960s London, a synonym for the exploitative landlord. Rackman was a Polish Jewish émigré who had survived the war by a series of accidents and escapes that read like a separate story in their own right, and who had arrived in England determined to accumulate the security that his European experience had taught him was the only real insurance against catastrophe. He had done so by acquiring rundown properties in the newly multiracial areas of West London, Notting Hill and its surroundings, and filling them with tenants, many of them recent immigrants from the Caribbean, at rents that the tenants' limited options compelled them to accept and under conditions that no one in a position of less vulnerability would have tolerated. Rackman was not a figure who belonged in the same social world as cabinet ministers and Soviet attachés, and yet the particular fluidity of London in the early 1960s, the way that money and beauty functioned as universal solvent in a city that was simultaneously very traditional and very new, placed him at the edges of Ward's orbit. Christine had become involved with him. Rackman was not violent. Accounts describe him as genuinely charming in his direct way, generous with money and extravagant in his personal arrangements. But he was the kind of man whose world was not safe, whose means of accumulation were not clean, and whose death from a heart attack in November 1962, when Christine was 20, left her without whatever protection his proximity had offered. More dangerous, in the immediate sense, were the other men in Christine's life during this period. She had met, through the social circuits of West London, two West Indian men whose subsequent involvement in her life would ultimately be the mechanism by which the story became public. The first was Aloysius Gordon, called Lucky Gordon, a jazz singer from the Caribbean who had developed a genuine attachment to Christine and whose attachment became, as such things can become, a source of anxiety when her interest did not match his in intensity. The second was Johnny Edgecombe, a man with a more volatile temperament, who also became intensely involved with Christine during 1962. The relationships between Christine and these two men were complicated by jealousy and by the particular social dynamics of a young woman caught between two people who had each developed a possessive investment in her company. The jealousy between Gordon and Edgecombe eventually produced a violent confrontation between the two men, a fight that left Lucky Gordon with a knife wound in November 1962. For which Edgecombe was the suspected party and for which a warrant was subsequently issued. Understanding this context matters because it was Edgecombe's violence, his subsequent action, taken out of a combination of desperation and jealousy, that finally broke the story into the public sphere and removed it from the controlled environment of rumor and whisper in which the establishment had been managing it. But in the middle of 1962, the story was still contained. Profumo was managing. Ward was operating. The security service had issued its quiet warning and retired to its position of watchful distance. And the country had things other than the personal arrangements of its cabinet ministers to occupy its attention. The rumors in Westminster were already circulating by the middle of 1962, quietly enough that they had not yet become a crisis but persistently enough that people in the right positions were collecting them. The journalism of the period was not the aggressive adversarial creature it would become. The libel laws of the early 1960s were genuinely inhibiting, and the press was still operating within the conventions of a deference toward public figures that the decade had not yet fully dismantled. But the informal networks of Westminster gossip are older than the press and more porous than the law, and the story of a cabinet minister and a showgirl and a Soviet attaché was exactly the kind of material that those networks were built to carry. The rumors had various sources. Some came from the social world around Ward itself, where too many people had seen too many things over too much time. Christine was not discreet by nature, and she had, over the year since the affair ended, made comments in the hearing of various people that were not calculated to maintain the story's containment. She was not, it should be understood, engaged in any deliberate campaign to expose Profumo. She was simply a young woman in a complicated and often unhappy situation, who had things to say about that situation and who did not always have compelling reasons to keep them entirely to herself. The security dimension of the rumors was being tracked in parallel. The Vassal affair, the conviction of the Admiralty spy in October 1962, had prompted a general elevation of anxiety about Soviet penetration at the senior levels of government, and this anxiety was doing its natural work of making people search their memories and their files for other potential vulnerabilities. Those who were aware of the Ward-Ivanov-Christine triangle were under renewed pressure to assess whether the earlier management of the situation had been adequate, and the honest answer was that it was becoming increasingly hard to argue that it had been. The government's whip's office knew. Parts of MI5 knew. Some newspaper editors were accumulating the story without yet having a legal route to publication. A Labour MP named George Wigg, who had been building a detailed knowledge of the affair through his own intelligence contacts and who was genuinely motivated by what he saw as a serious security matter rather than merely a political opportunity, though those two motivations are not always cleanly separable, was in the process of deciding what to do with what he knew. The autumn of 1962 moved toward winter, and the pieces moved toward the moment of collision with the steady, unhurried logic of objects in motion on a collision course. Christine was growing more desperate. Her circumstances were deteriorating. Her relationship with Edgecombe was becoming increasingly unstable. The various men who had positioned themselves as patrons and protectors were losing their ability or their willingness to maintain those positions. She was 20 years old, and the world that had opened itself to her at Murray's Cabaret Club was revealing the costs embedded in its original offer, presenting the bill with the customary coldness of systems that have no interest in protecting those they have used. December 1962 was 3 weeks away, and in December Johnny Edgecombe was going to fire a gun. The world around Christine Keeler in the second half of 1962 had the quality of a structure losing its load-bearing capacity. Not yet collapsed, but already producing the sounds and movements that precede collapse, the small cracks and the unsettled foundations that, to anyone who knows how to read them, announce what is coming. She was not living at Wimpole Mews by this point. The circumstances of her daily life had shifted through the year as the various relationships and arrangements that made up her existence underwent their own redistributions. She had moved through several addresses, several connections, several configurations of the company she kept. This is not a story of a woman in control of her circumstances. It is a story of a young woman who has been embedded in a system that has no mechanism for releasing people like her, that grants access without granting security, and that has already taken everything it requires from her while not yet admitting that the exchange is complete. Peter Rackman's death in November 1962 removed one of the more stable elements of her financial and personal landscape. Whatever his numerous failings as a landlord and as a human being operating in the moral universe of commerce, Rackman had been genuinely generous with Christine in the personal sphere, providing her with accommodation and with the particular kind of practical support that money can supply when it is deployed without conditions. His death was sudden, a heart attack at the age of 43, and it left behind a very different kind of absence from the one that the end of the Profumo affair had created. The Profumo affair had ended with a polite finality. Rackman's death was simply a door closing without warning, and its closure accelerated the destabilization of a life that was already in a precarious equilibrium. The men who remained most persistently in her life by the autumn of 1962 were Lucky Gordon and Johnny Edgecombe, and the dynamic between all three of them had developed the particular heat of a situation in which multiple people are pursuing incompatible purposes in a very small social space. Gordon had known Christine longer, and his feeling for her, in the accounts that have survived, appears to have been genuine in the specific way that can make a man's behavior toward a woman more frightening rather than less. Genuine attachment, when it is not reciprocated equally, and when it is combined with a conviction that the beloved belongs to you in some fundamental sense, produces a jealousy that logic cannot reach. Edgecombe was different in temperament, more impulsive, less patient, the kind of man who expressed himself through action rather than through sustained emotional pressure. He had been involved with Christine from earlier in 1962, and the relationship had had the intensity of something that burns hot and fast, producing heat without much structural durability. By the autumn, the connection between Christine and Edgecombe was already complicated by the fight that had taken place between Edgecombe and Lucky Gordon in the summer, the confrontation that had left Gordon cut and that had generated a warrant for Edgecombe's arrest. With the warrant outstanding, Edgecombe's movements became more constrained and his state of mind, predictably, more volatile. The combination of a criminal proceeding hanging over him, the tensions of his relationship with Christine, and the awareness that she was not as exclusively attached to him as he wished produced exactly the kind of pressure that volatile men find difficult to manage without the pressure finding some external expression. On December 14, 1962, that expression arrived. Christine was at Wimpole Mews, Ward's flat, with Mandy Rice Davies on that afternoon. Whether she was there for reasons related to Ward or simply because the familiar geography still drew her back is one of those details that the subsequent accounts do not fully resolve. What is clear is that Edgecombe arrived at the address. He wanted to see Christine. He wanted to speak with her about their situation, or to force some kind of resolution to a set of tensions that had been building for months. What he found was a locked door and a window above him with Christine's face in it, or the face of Mandy, accounts vary slightly, and the refusal to admit him to the building. What happened next was the sound that broke everything open. Edgecombe, standing in the mews outside the building, produced a pistol and fired at the door. The shots hit the door itself and the surrounding woodwork. Nobody inside the building was struck. The shooting, from a tactical standpoint, was not particularly effective. But from the standpoint of what it set in motion, it was enormously consequential. The police were called. Edgecombe was arrested. He was charged with a firearms offense, with causing grievous bodily harm and with possession of an illegal firearm, and a trial was scheduled. The trial would require witnesses. The witnesses would include Christine Keeler. And Christine Keeler's appearance as a witness in a criminal trial, her willingness or unwillingness to testify, the nature of her public role in the proceedings, was about to make the question of who she was and what she knew a matter for the press and the public in a way that none of the existing management mechanisms were going to be able to prevent. This is where the story enters its most dangerous phase, not because of the shooting itself, but because of the apparatus of public proceedings that the shooting set in motion. A criminal trial is a public event. Its participants are named. Its witnesses are on record. A shooting at a specific address involving specific people inevitably produces journalistic interest, and journalists who began asking questions about the shooting at 17 Wimpole Mews were going to find very quickly that the address was associated with Ward, that Ward was associated with Ivanov and with Profumo, and that the woman at the window of the building had a personal history that bore on the reputations of some very prominent people. The editors of several British newspapers were already in possession of versions of the story about Profumo and Christine by late 1962. The specific legal obstacle was not knowledge but proof, not the substantive challenge of establishing the truth but the practical challenge of publishing something that Profumo would deny and that the libel laws of the time made extraordinarily expensive to get wrong. British libel law in the early 1960s placed the burden of proving truth on the publisher, which meant that printing a story about a cabinet minister's affair without the minister's admission or documentary corroboration was a risk that even the most aggressive newspapers thought carefully about before taking. The shooting at Wimpole Mews lowered the legal obstacle considerably because it provided a news peg, a real event involving real people with real criminal charges, around which the broader story could begin to coalesce without requiring the newspaper to assert directly that the affair had taken place. Journalists could cover the trial and its peripheries. They could write about Edgecombe without necessarily writing about Profumo, but in writing about Edgecombe they would be building the context within which Profumo's name would eventually appear, named by people who could not be controlled in circumstances that the law could not easily suppress. Ward understood this. He began reaching out to contacts, attempting to manage the story before it could fully form. He spoke to various journalists. He made telephone calls. He had conversations with people in the political world whose discretion he believed he could rely on, or whose interest in the situation's management aligned with his own. He was, in his frantic way, still operating as the social fixer, the man who could make introductions and smooth paths and prevent collisions between things that were heading toward each other. But his resources for this kind of management were diminishing, and the forces he was trying to contain were considerably larger than anything he had managed before. He had always operated at the intersection of worlds that were not supposed to intersect, and he had always managed the tensions that this intersection produced through a combination of charm and discretion and the collective willingness of all involved parties to pretend that the boundaries they were crossing did not exist. That collective willingness was breaking down. The system of mutual protection that the English establishment had always maintained for its members was beginning to fail, because the story was no longer contained within the establishment's control, and because some of the people involved in the story had interests that were not served by its continued concealment. Christine's own position was deteriorating further. She was by this point dealing not only with the aftermath of the Edgecombe shooting, but with the ongoing menace of Lucky Gordon, who had not ceased his pursuit of her despite the months that had passed. Her life in the latter weeks of 1962 and the early weeks of 1963 was shaped by fear of a kind that the social world of Cliveden had never prepared her to navigate, and by the dawning understanding that the men who had drawn her into their orbit had no particular mechanism for protecting her when she needed protection. She was the central figure in a story that powerful men wanted to manage, but she was not a person those men felt any particular obligation to protect. She was evidence. She was a problem. She was the detail that needed to be contained. She was also a woman with her own mind, who had seen enough by this point to understand something about the nature of the arrangement she had been included in, and who was moving, not yet deliberately, not yet strategically, but with the slow momentum of someone whose patience with being managed is finally approaching its limit, toward the moment when she would decide that the story was hers to tell. The trial of Johnny Edgecombe was scheduled for March 1963. In the weeks before it came to court, the elements of the story that had been circulating in restricted channels began their movement into broader visibility with the unhurried logic of a spring flood building behind a dam. The pressure had been constructing itself for over a year. What was about to change was not the pressure but the dam. In early 1963, Christine Keeler sold her story to a Sunday newspaper. The paper was the Sunday Pictorial, one of the popular Sunday tabloids with a mass readership and an editorial culture that was considerably less inhibited by establishment deference than its broadsheet contemporaries. The payment was in the neighborhood of £1,000, a very substantial sum for a young woman with Christine's limited resources, and the account she provided gave the newspaper a version of events that centered on her relationship with Profumo and her knowledge of Ivanov. The newspaper, however, did not immediately publish. The legal risk was still considerable, and the decision was made, after consultation with the paper's lawyers, to hold the story while the situation developed. That the story had been sold was itself significant. The act of selling it, committing the account to paper, placing it in the hands of an institution that had a commercial interest in its eventual publication, was a threshold crossed. The information was no longer exclusively mobile through private channels. It was documented. It was in a drawer, and the people who knew it was in the drawer had different interests and timelines from the people who were still attempting to manage the situation through the quiet mechanisms of the establishment. Ward, from his position at the center of the network, was aware that things were moving beyond his control. He had conversations during this period with a member of parliament named George Whig, who was a Labour backbencher with a long-time interest in intelligence and defense matters, and who had been building his own detailed picture of the affair through contacts in the security world. The conversations between Ward and Whig have been reported in various forms by various subsequent accounts, and their exact content is disputed, but their general nature is not. Ward was attempting to manage the story through political channels, to find interlocutors who might either suppress it or direct its emergence in a way that would not destroy him along with everyone else. Whig was not interested in suppression. He was interested in accountability, and he was calculating when and how to deploy what he knew to maximum political effect. The Edgecombe trial opened in March 1963, and on its first morning the press and the clerks and the officials and the spectators in the public gallery all waited for a witness who did not come. Christine Keeler did not appear. She had left England. The specifics of her absence have never been entirely resolved, whether she left because she was frightened of Gordon and Edgecombe and the violence that surrounded them, or because someone advised or pressured her to absent herself, or because her own judgment was that appearing in a public trial at that moment would destroy what little control she still retained over her own situation. The reality may have contained all of these elements simultaneously. Her absence from the trial was itself a news story. Fleet Street was covering the Edgecombe case and found the non-appearance of the central witness immediately interesting. The questions that her absence generated, where was she? Why had she gone? Who was she? Were questions that could not be answered without bringing into view the wider landscape of her life, and that landscape included Stephen Ward and his world and the specific individuals who populated it. By March of 1963, the story was being processed simultaneously in several different forms. The press was circling it from the outside. Westminster was circling it from the inside. The security service was watching from its characteristic distance. And the particular mechanism through which the whole arrangement finally became undeniable arrived in the form of a parliamentary proceeding that used one of the most ancient and most powerful conventions of the British Constitution to say what the newspapers still could not legally say. On the evening of March 21, 1963, George Whig rose in the House of Commons during a debate on a matter unrelated to the Profumo affair. The specific context was a discussion arising from the Vassall case, and invoked the protection of parliamentary privilege to raise the rumors about a cabinet minister and a young woman and their implications for national security. Parliamentary privilege is the constitutional principle that protects members of parliament from civil or criminal proceedings arising from what they say within the House. What is said in Parliament cannot be the subject of a libel action. It cannot be prevented from being reported in newspapers, because the reporting of parliamentary proceedings carries its own legal protections. Parliamentary privilege is, in the architecture of British constitutional law, the mechanism through which things that are unsayable outside the building become sayable inside it. Whig did not name John Profumo directly in his speech. He did not need to. He spoke of rumors circulating in the press concerning a minister, and he called on the government to either deny or confirm those rumors. What he said was specific enough that everyone in the chamber immediately understood what he was referring to. Other MPs, among them Barbara Castle and Richard Crossman, both senior Labour figures, reinforced the call. The government was now formally on notice. The story had entered Parliament. It could no longer be contained by the private management of well-connected men. The next morning, March 22, 1963, the political and personal mechanisms of the entire crisis began to move at a speed that replaced the slow accumulation of the previous 18 months with something far more compressed and far more violent in its political effects. Profumo was contacted by the government's chief whip, Martin Redmayne, and by the Solicitor General and by other ministerial colleagues, and the discussions that took place in the early hours of the morning of the 22nd are among the most intensely examined conversations in modern British political history. Profumo maintained that the relationship with Christine had not been improper in the relevant sense. He maintained this. He said it to the chief whip and to the Solicitor General and to the colleagues who arrived at various points through what became a sleepless night of crisis management. He said it with conviction, with the full deployment of the social confidence and the professional authority that he had spent his entire career constructing. He was lying. Whether he understood in those early morning hours that the lie was unsustainable, whether some part of him genuinely believed he could hold the position, is a question about a man's interior state that the surviving evidence does not answer. He was a politician with decades of experience in the management of appearances. He was also a human being under extraordinary pressure, faced with the prospect of a catastrophic public humiliation that would not only destroy his career but would devastate his wife and leave his reputation for the rest of his life defined by a single enormous dishonesty. It is not surprising that he lied. It is somewhat surprising, given everything that followed, that he believed the lie would hold. On the morning of March 22, 1963, Profumo made a personal statement to the House of Commons. A personal statement, in the conventions of Parliament, is a specific kind of address that other members receive without immediate challenge. A statement made on the member's personal honor, outside the cut and thrust of debate, under the implicit assumption that what is being said is the full truth. Profumo stood at the dispatch box and said the following words, which Westminster would not forget for the rest of the century. There was no impropriety whatsoever in my acquaintance with Miss Keeler. He said this to the assembled House. He said it clearly and with the confidence of a man who had decided that confidence was the only possible approach. He said it with Valerie in the gallery above, there at his request, her presence designed to add weight to the implicit message that a man with such a wife could not possibly be what the rumor suggested. The statement was received, such was the convention, such was the deference that the rules of the House required, in silence. His colleagues accepted what he said because the rules required acceptance, and because the alternative, calling a colleague a liar to his face on the floor of the House, required a certainty that the conventions of the institution protected its members from having to produce. The statement was a political act. It was also a catastrophic error, because the truth was in existence. It was in the notes he had written to Christine. It was in the memories of Christine, of Mandy, of Ward, of various other people who had been in the rooms where various things had occurred. And the truth, given sufficient time and sufficient pressure, has a way of making itself known regardless of what is said from the dispatch box of the House of Commons. He had bought himself time. The problem was that time, in this situation, was not neutral. Time was the mechanism through which the story would find its full dimensions, and those dimensions, once fully visible, would be impossible to manage from behind the position he had just committed himself to defending. The weeks following the parliamentary statement of March 22nd had the quality of a slow catastrophe in which all the participants could see what was coming and none could prevent it. Profumo had said what he had said, and having said it, he was now committed to its maintenance with the full force of his public and legal authority. He had consulted lawyers before the statement. He had, in the days immediately following it, issued letters threatening defamation proceedings against publications that had printed or were considering printing the allegations. He had placed himself with the statement at the maximum available distance from the truth, and the distance between that position and reality was now the full measure of the catastrophe that was building. Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister, had accepted the statement at face value. This acceptance has been the subject of considerable debate in the decades since, the central question being whether Macmillan genuinely believed Profumo or whether he chose to believe him because believing him was the only operationally available option given where the government already stood. The distinction matters because it is the difference between a prime minister who was deceived and one who was complicit in the deception, and opinions on which characterization is more accurate have varied depending on the political sympathies of the person doing the characterizing. What is documented is that Macmillan did not himself interrogate Profumo in advance of the statement. The questioning of Profumo was done by others, the Chief Whip, the Solicitor General, colleagues, and their reports to Macmillan were sufficient, in the Prime Minister's judgment, to permit him to accept the denial without requiring a personal conversation in which he would have been required to look Profumo in the eyes and ask him directly whether he had been sleeping with a showgirl who had also been sleeping with a Soviet intelligence officer. The avoidance of that conversation is itself a kind of answer, though what kind of answer depends very much on your view of Macmillan's character. The Prime Minister by 1963 was 70 years old and had been in office for 6 years. He had taken over from Anthony Eden in the aftermath of Suez, the catastrophic foreign policy adventure that had destroyed Eden's government and effectively ended Britain's pretensions to independent great power status, and he had steadied the Conservative Party and the country with a combination of genuine political skill and a carefully constructed public persona of unflappable Edwardian calm. His nickname was Supermac, an irony-laden tribute to his apparent imperviousness to political buffeting that had been coined by a cartoonist and that Macmillan had made peace with by incorporating it into his own self-presentation. He was a man of considerable intelligence and genuine complexity, whose internal life was concealed behind a public manner of patrician theatricality. He was also a man who had sustained a deeply painful private wound that may have affected his willingness to confront certain kinds of truths directly. His wife, Dorothy Macmillan, had for decades maintained an open relationship with Robert Boothby, a conservative MP, that was widely known in political circles and that had caused Macmillan a sustained private misery he bore without public acknowledgement. Whether this experience made him more or less likely to probe the personal details of a minister's alleged affair is, again, a matter of interpretation. What it certainly did was make him, of all the people who might have challenged Profumo, perhaps the one with the most complicated relationship to the subject of a politician's undisclosed personal life. The weeks ticked by. The story was in the newspapers, but not yet as the story. It was in the newspapers as a story about a missing witness and a shooting in a mews and various colorful characters associated with a West End social world, and the name Profumo was in the newspapers in connection with the parliamentary statement denying impropriety. The newspapers were covering the defense without being quite able to articulate the offense, which is one of the stranger textual qualities of the period of the affair between March and June of 1963. Beneath the surface, the real reporting was being done by journalists who were building their files, assembling the pieces, testing the legal ground. The Sunday Pictorial, which still held Christine's account, was in conversation with its lawyers. The News of the World was developing its own version of the story. Various other publications were circling the specific details that would allow them to publish within the protection of the law. The general principle was that once Profumo's denial had been made the central public claim, the story that refuted it became more defensible, because it was now responding to a specific false assertion rather than making an unsolicited original allegation. What the press could not yet publish with certainty, the gossip network of Westminster had long since accepted as established fact. Labour MPs were receiving their own briefings through their own channels. The Security Service's involvement, and the questions it raised about the adequacy of the government's management of a potential intelligence compromise, were being pressed in private conversations by people who had not yet found the public mechanism for raising them. The mechanism, when it arrived, came through two channels simultaneously, and the simultaneity was what finally broke the story open completely. The first was legal. Lucky Gordon, Christine's former companion, had been charged with assault in connection with injuries she had sustained. The trial of Lucky Gordon in May 1963 required Christine to appear as a witness. She appeared. She gave testimony. She was in the courtroom, named, publicly identified, questioned under oath, and therefore available to the press in a way that a private individual was normally not. Her presence in the witness box made her a public figure in the precise legal sense, and the presence of a public figure in a courtroom makes everything related to that figure a legitimate subject of journalistic inquiry in ways that private life does not. The Gordon trial was, from the point of view of the concealed story's exposure, a controlled detonation. Reporters who covered it were building their files with every session. Editors were instructing their journalists to be thorough. And Christine herself, under the procedural pressure of being a witness while simultaneously being surrounded by lawyers and journalists and people with various interests in various versions of her story, was a woman whose situation had become simply too complex and too volatile for any single version or any single party's management to contain. The second channel was the continued political pressure. Labour's leadership had by this point made the decision that the Profumo matter was a legitimate and serious political issue. Not merely a personal scandal to be exploited for party advantage, but a genuine question of national security and of the government's honesty with Parliament. Harold Wilson, who had succeeded Hugh Gaitskell as Labour leader in January 1963 following Gaitskell's sudden death, was a very different kind of politician from his predecessor, sharper, more tactical, more willing to use the instruments of parliamentary pressure with aggressive precision. Wilson's advisors were building the case. The parliamentary questions were multiplying. The government's answers were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain with a straight face. The third element, and this was the one that nobody had fully accounted for, because it operated outside the formal systems and therefore outside the formal management capacity of the people who were trying to control events, was Christine herself. She was 21 years old. She had been cast by all the parties in this story as a passive element. A young woman whose specific function was to have been the occasion for the affair, who could be managed and controlled and positioned and directed by whoever was currently in her vicinity. She had been sold a version of access and glamour that had turned out to include serious violence, professional jeopardy, sustained fear, and the particular experience of being simultaneously central to a major story and entirely without power within it. Years later, in her own accounts of these months, she described a feeling of being trapped inside a narrative that was happening to her rather than being made by her, of watching decisions about her life being made by men who consulted her interests as they might consult a weather report, acknowledged as a factor without any real weight. But Christine Keeler had not disappeared. She had not been silenced. She was an intelligent woman who had survived more than most 21-year-olds are required to survive, and the intelligence and the survival instinct that had carried her this far were still operative. She was talking to journalists. She was talking to lawyers. She was, in the phrase that the politicians dreaded, not controllable. She was a woman who knew what she knew, and the question of whether that knowledge would emerge in a form that served the establishment's preference for managed silence or in a form that served her own need to speak honestly and to be accurately represented was now, finally, entirely beyond anyone else's ability to determine. By late May 1963, the press had enough. The legal calculations had shifted, the documentary evidence had been assembled, the sources had been interviewed, the lawyers had been satisfied. The publications that had been holding the story were preparing to hold it no longer. The quiet word was no longer going to be sufficient. The machinery of exposure, having been building pressure for more than 18 months, was on the verge of completing the work it had been preparing to do ever since a summer evening in July of 1961, when a man in a good suit and a girl without a swimsuit had found themselves on the same side of the same garden hedge. John Profumo had 12 days left in his political career. The statement that John Profumo had delivered to the House of Commons on the morning of March 22nd had performed one particular function with a great deal of skill, even as it failed in every other respect. It had made the lie official. It had moved his denial from the informal realm of the personal, the whip's conversations, the late-night discussions with colleagues, into the formal record of parliamentary proceedings, where it stood as a point of public constitutional significance rather than merely a private assertion. The House of Commons regards statements made to it as a matter of Parliament's own honor, not merely that of the individual member, and the falsification of such a statement is therefore not simply a personal dishonesty but an offense against the institution itself. This is not merely ceremonial. The House of Commons has, since its earliest history, treated the integrity of what is said within its walls as the foundational condition of its operation. A government that maintained power through false statements made to Parliament was, in this constitutional logic, not merely dishonest but illegitimate in its fundamental claim to exercise authority on behalf of the people. Profumo had understood all of this. His legal training and his decades in Parliament had given him a precise understanding of exactly what he was doing when he made the statement. He was not naive about the risk. He had calculated that the risk of exposure was manageable, that the people who knew the truth were either unable or unwilling to produce it in a legally actionable form, and that the weight of his position and his social authority was sufficient to tip the scale of public credibility in his favor against the word of a showgirl and the social world of an osteopath. He had miscalculated every element of this assessment except the last, which is that his social authority was indeed considerable. The problem was that social authority, whatever its worth within the establishment's own social world, had no power over the specific administrative mechanism that was now working against him. The accumulation of documented accounts by people with first-hand knowledge, processed through the institutional channels of the British press, operating under the protection of parliamentary reporting that George Whig had so precisely opened up. The papers published in the first days of June 1963. The Sunday Mirror broke the story in its most explicit form, with the news of the world following. The coverage was circumspect by the standards of what the newspapers privately knew. The full account, with all its Cold War dimensions and its intelligence dimensions and its specific details about the various participants, was at that point still being assembled, but it was sufficient to make entirely clear what the story was. The affair between the Secretary of State for War and Christine Keeler, the overlap with Ivanov, the security questions that this overlap raised, and the statement to Parliament that had denied all of it. All of this was now in the public domain, circulating in the Sunday morning editions that were read across the country over breakfast. The response from Profumo was initially nothing. He was in Venice with his wife. He could have remained in Italy. Some part of his calculation may have rested on the possibility that distance and silence would allow the story's first surge of attention to peak and recede before his return. This is another miscalculation, though perhaps this time a forgivable one, because there was no version of the story in which distance and silence were going to work. The thing that had been set in motion on March 22nd, the formal lie on the parliamentary record, was not something that time would absorb. It was a point of reference, fixed in the official record of the House, to which all subsequent reporting returned. Every newspaper story that described the affair was also, implicitly, a demonstration that the parliamentary statement was false, and every day on which the parliamentary statement was false and on the record and not yet corrected was another day on which Profumo's position was untenable. He returned to England. His lawyers and his colleagues were in contact with him. The conversations in these days, the specific discussions between Profumo and the people around him about what was to be done, are documented in available accounts only in broad outline, because the parties to them had obvious reasons to be selective in their subsequent descriptions of what was said. What is documented is the outcome. On June 4, 1963, John Profumo wrote a letter to Harold Macmillan in which he acknowledged that the statement he had made to the House of Commons on March 22 had been untrue, that the statement had been made to protect his wife and family, and that he was accordingly resigning from the government and from Parliament. The letter is a document of extraordinary compression. It is not a long letter. It does not elaborate greatly on the circumstances or the reasoning. It does what resignation letters from politicians who have been caught in serious dishonesty always do. It performs the minimum necessary acknowledgement of the offense while containing the damage to the smallest possible parameter. What it says is, "I lied. I am going. I am sorry." The Macmillan government received the letter and understood immediately that the political situation it described was severe beyond any of the management that had been applied to it over the preceding months. The Prime Minister had been told by his Secretary of State for War, to his face or through intermediaries, that there had been no impropriety. The Secretary of State had then made a statement to Parliament to this effect. The statement was now revealed to be a lie. This meant that either the Prime Minister had known the statement was a lie and had permitted it to stand, which would make the Prime Minister complicit in a fraud on Parliament, or the Prime Minister had been deceived by his own minister, which would make the Prime Minister an instrument of that fraud without his knowledge. Neither characterization was comfortable. Both were being made simultaneously in different parts of the political world with equal force. Macmillan's response to receiving the letter has been described by people who were near him at the time as a combination of personal devastation and professional alarm in proportions that cannot be cleanly separated. He had believed Profumo, or he had chosen to believe him, or the distinction between those two things had, in the specific context of political crisis management, not appeared consequential at the time. Now the distinction appeared very consequential indeed, because Macmillan's continued authority rested on the credibility of his assurance that the government had acted properly throughout, and that assurance was being examined with a directness that the conventions of peacetime British politics rarely produced. The opposition was merciless, as opposition was supposed to be in such circumstances. Harold Wilson, leading Labour's assault on the government's handling of the affair, was precise and relentless in his questioning. He wanted to know what Macmillan had known and when. He wanted to know why the security implications had not been more aggressively pursued. He wanted to know why a cabinet minister had been permitted to lie to Parliament without any mechanism catching him in the lie. These were legitimate questions. They were also devastating ones because the answers to all of them, honestly supplied, pointed to the same conclusion: that the British establishment had protected one of its own at the expense of the truth, and that the protection had failed not because the establishment had insufficient motivation to maintain it, but because it had chosen the wrong mechanism. The debate that took place in the House of Commons on June 17, 1963, in the immediate aftermath of Profumo's resignation, was one of the most brutal parliamentary encounters of the post-war era. Macmillan defended himself and his government with what all accounts describe as genuine emotion. Not the calculated deployment of political effect, but the expression of a man who was genuinely wounded, who felt personally betrayed, and who was attempting to explain a catastrophic failure of judgment while under the most intense public scrutiny of his career. The speech was widely acknowledged, even by his attackers, as a performance of considerable dignity in circumstances of extreme difficulty. It was not sufficient to restore his authority. The damage was too fundamental for any speech to repair. In the midst of the parliamentary debate, as Macmillan defended himself and Wilson pressed the attack and the conservative backbench divided between those who were loyal and those who had concluded that the Prime Minister's time was over, a number of the government's most senior figures were taking private stock of what the story had revealed about the condition of the administration they served. Some of them were concluding that the party and the country were best served by a change in leadership. Others were concluding that the Prime Minister would and should fight on. The internal mathematics of the Conservative Party's confidence in its leader were being recalculated in real time in the corridors of Westminster, as the parliamentary debate produced its verdict on a government that had managed its greatest security and political test of the decade with a combination of complacency and institutional deference that now appeared very difficult to defend. The lie was out. The liar had resigned. The Prime Minister was wounded. And the story was not over. It was, in fact, barely halfway through its total political consequences. Because there was still the matter of the man who had been at the center of the whole network. Stephen Ward had been arrested, and now the machinery of English justice was about to attempt something that his prosecutors would have called accountability and his defenders would call, with considerable justification, a sacrifice. Lord Denning was 73 years old in the summer of 1963, a judge of exceptional reputation who had spent his career developing a jurisprudence notable for its attention to justice in the ordinary human sense as well as in the technical legal sense. He was appointed by Harold Macmillan to conduct the official inquiry into the security implications of the Profumo affair, and his report, delivered in September 1963 after an intensive period of investigation and interview, became one of the most widely read official documents in British publishing history. The first edition sold out on the day of publication. Subsequent editions were rushed through. People queued for copies. A government inquiry had, for the first and perhaps only time in British history, acquired the popularity of a best-selling novel. What Denning was asked to investigate was specific: whether the security of the state had been compromised, whether the information available to the government at various points had been properly handled, and whether the various allegations of sexual impropriety involving ministers and other public figures required any specific action. He was not asked to relitigate the Profumo affair itself, that had produced its own outcome, but to examine the systemic failures that had allowed it to develop as it had, and to assess the national security dimension with the precision that only a formal investigation with the power to require the attendance of witnesses could provide. The inquiry's conclusions about the security dimension were, in the end, moderately reassuring in their specific claims and deeply alarming in their broader implications. Denning found no evidence that classified information had been passed to Ivanov through Christine or any other source in the Ward network. He accepted Profumo's assertion that no classified matters had been discussed during the affair. But he also found, with considerable clarity, that the handling of the situation by the security service and by the cabinet had been inadequate, that the warning given to Profumo had been too gentle, that the follow-up had been too trusting, and that the institutional preference for managing difficult situations quietly through informal channels had failed entirely where a more rigorous and formal intervention was clearly warranted. The report also contained something that no official document of its era would normally have contained: accounts of sexual behavior involving a range of public figures that were presented with a directness that made the document simultaneously a work of public administration and a piece of social history. Denning had interviewed a very large number of people, including Christine, including Mandy Rice-Davies, including various politicians and members of the establishment, and what they told him about the social world around Ward was deposited in the report's pages without the protective discretion that had previously surrounded such matters in official documents. The Denning report is, in this sense, a document that reveals its era in the act of investigating it. The language is careful and often circuitous. There is much use of the phrase improper association, But the content is explicit enough that the document's popularity with the general public was entirely predictable. England, in September 1963, discovered that parts of its establishment had been conducting themselves in ways that the establishment had always denied or ignored, and the discovery was simultaneously scandalous and oddly satisfying, a confirmation of suspicions that many people had long held but had never expected to see substantiated in a document bearing the Lord Chancellor's approval. But before Denning reported, there was the matter of Stephen Ward. Ward had been arrested on June 8, 1963, 4 days after Profumo's resignation letter, while the political crisis was at its peak. The charge was living off immoral earnings under S.30 of the Sexual Offences Act 1956. The specific allegation was that Ward had received money from Christine Keeler and Mandy Rice-Davies in exchange for the use of his flat at Wimpole Mews, on the basis that both women were engaged in prostitution and that the payments represented Ward's share of the proceeds of that prostitution. The quality of the legal argument is something that subsequent analysis has treated with considerable skepticism. The legal definition of living off immoral earnings requires not merely that money was received from a woman who had at some point engaged in sexual activity for reward, but that the specific income received was causally connected to that activity, that the recipient was, in effect, profiting from the prostitution itself rather than merely having a financial arrangement with someone who happened to be a prostitute. The evidence that Ward had done this in the precise legal sense was contestable. That Christine and Mandy had received money from men in exchange for sex was itself far from straightforwardly established. Both women, and especially Christine, resisted the characterization of their activities as prostitution in any simple sense. The trial began on July 22, 1963, at the Central Criminal Court at the Old Bailey. It was conducted in the full glare of press attention that the Profumo affair had been generating for 3 months. The public gallery was full at every session. The newspapers provided daily coverage. The trial occupied a space in the public consciousness that no ordinary criminal proceeding would ever reach, and it did so because Ward, for all the ambiguity of his precise legal culpability, was understood by everyone, the press, the public, the political world, and Ward himself, to occupy a position that was something much larger than that of a defendant in a sexual offenses case. Ward was on trial, in the symbolic sense, for the entire social world that the Profumo affair had illuminated. He was the man who knew everyone. He was the man whose flat had been the venue. He was the man whose connections had made possible the particular configuration of people whose behavior had now destroyed a minister, embarrassed a prime minister, and raised questions about the integrity of the security service. He was the node through which all the relevant connections passed, and in prosecuting him, the state was implicitly attempting to draw a line around the scandal, to locate its cause in the person of Ward rather than in the structural conditions of a class society that had allowed and even encouraged the specific dynamics he had exploited. Many people, including some of Ward's severest critics, found this identification troubling. The case against Ward required, in its factual substance, that Christine Keeler be treated as a prostitute. Christine did not accept this characterization. Her own accounts, given in evidence and subsequently, drew a distinction between the arrangements she had made with various men and the specific commercial transaction that the law of prostitution described. Whether the jury accepted this distinction depended, as such things always depend, on a complex mixture of legal analysis and social attitude. In the 1963 jury's case, the social attitude was being formed in a climate of sustained moral panic, in a country that had spent 6 months reading daily coverage of the sexual conduct of its establishment figures and was looking for someone to hold responsible. Ward's friends deserted him. This was one of the most commented upon aspects of his trial, and it says something sharp and true about the nature of the establishment solidarity on which Ward had relied throughout his career. The men he had helped, the men he had treated and drawn and introduced and amused and provided with company and conversation for 20 years. The men whose names appeared in his sketchbooks and his address books and who had come to his parties and accepted his invitations to Cliveden, retreated en masse to a distance from which they could not be associated with his proceedings. Lord Astor raised his eyebrows and said nothing. Lord Denning investigated and found nothing to implicate, and cleared the aristocratic names that Ward had mentioned in his own defense. The political figures who had moved through Ward's world were nowhere to be seen at the Old Bailey. The isolation was complete, and Ward felt it with a clarity that his letters and conversations from the trial period make plain. He had built his life on the premise that the connections he cultivated were real, that the relationships he maintained were reciprocal, that the social capital he had accumulated through decades of charm and skill and useful introduction had created a web of obligation that would, when he needed it, support him. He was now discovering, at the worst possible moment, that the web was one-directional, that the obligations he had believed were owing to him were entirely unofficial, entirely revocable, and subject to immediate withdrawal the moment maintaining them became uncomfortable for the people who held them. His mental state during the trial deteriorated visibly. He was a man of 60 years, facing a charge that struck at the very identity he had constructed, publicly humiliated in the venue designed for the humiliation of the guilty, surrounded by reporters who were treating his proceedings as entertainment. He wrote letters in this period to various people, to newspapers, to figures in public life, that carried the tone of a man who was trying simultaneously to defend himself and to communicate something about the nature of what was being done to him that the formal proceedings were not designed to express. The letters are documents of considerable pathos, eloquent and increasingly desperate. The jury retired to consider its verdict on July 30th, 1963. On the night of July 30th, Stephen Ward took a large overdose of sleeping tablets at the flat of a friend where he was staying. He left a note. He was found unconscious the following morning and was taken to St. Stephen's Hospital in Fulham. He did not regain consciousness. The jury returned its verdict while Ward lay in his coma. He was found guilty on 2 counts of living off the immoral earnings of Christine Keeler and of another woman. The judge recorded the verdict in Ward's absence, noting the circumstances, and the verdict was of legal effect even though the man against whom it was pronounced was, at that moment, dying. Stephen Ward died on August 3, 1963. He was 50 years old. The establishment against which he had beaten himself had already moved on to other concerns. Harold Macmillan had governed Britain with the particular combination of intelligence and performance that his era rewarded in its senior statesmen. He had been, at various points in his career, genuinely farsighted on colonial independence, on Britain's relationship with the United States, on the practical limits of British power in the post-Suez world. He had won the 1959 election with a majority of 100 seats, the largest conservative majority of the post-war period, and he had done so partly on the strength of the famous phrase attributed to him, "You have never had it so good," which captured, however clumsily, the genuine improvement in living standards that the late 1950s had brought to a country that had spent the previous 15 years in austerity and reconstruction. That election result, confidently achieved, had seemed to mark the high point of a premiership that had been built on the solid ground of competence and continuity. By the autumn of 1963, that ground had been comprehensively eroded. The Profumo affair had done its work not simply by revealing a particular lie but by crystallizing a set of feelings about the Macmillan government and about the Conservative Party more broadly that had been forming for some time. The sense that the establishment was incompetent as well as self-serving, that the men in charge were both morally and intellectually inadequate to the demands of the modern world, had been present in British culture in various forms for several years before the Profumo affair gave it a specific and dramatic focus. Now it had that focus, and the public mood was one in which the satirical, the cynical, and the frankly contemptuous view of those in authority had replaced the deference of the previous decade with something much more corrosive. The satirical tide was visible in the culture of 1963 in specific and concrete ways. That was the week that was, the BBC television program that had launched in November 1962, was savaging the establishment weekly before audiences of millions. Beyond the Fringe, the review that had transferred from Edinburgh to London and then to New York, had been dissecting the absurdities of British public life with a precision and an irreverence that had made its authors famous and had helped legitimize a mode of public commentary in which no institution and no individual was beyond mockery. Private Eye magazine had been producing its specific brand of investigative mockery since 1961. The culture was changing faster than the political class had noticed, and the Profumo affair was both a product of that change and an accelerant of it. On October 8, 1963, Harold Macmillan resigned as Prime Minister. The official reason was ill health. He had been diagnosed with a prostatic obstruction that required surgical treatment, and he announced his resignation from hospital on the day the Conservative Party conference opened in Blackpool. The medical circumstances were real, but the political circumstances were also real, and the two sets of circumstances had combined to produce a situation in which a man of 70 years, who had been physically as well as politically weakened by the events of the preceding months, had concluded that the demands of continuing in office were more than he could sustain. His resignation from a hospital bed was itself a piece of Macmillan theater. There was something very characteristic in the timing, in the manner, in the way he communicated his decision to the party conference through a letter rather than through appearance. Whether this was the dignified exit of a man who had served well and was bowing to necessity, or the strategic retreat of a man whose authority had been destroyed and who was choosing the terms of his departure, depends on which account you find more compelling. Both are probably true in some proportion. The succession process that followed was itself a spectacle that deepened the impression of a party in disarray. There was no formal mechanism for choosing a conservative leader in 1963, the party operating instead on the basis of consultations and soundings and the mysterious emergence of a consensus that was, in practice, a negotiation between the party's senior figures conducted through the channels of the establishment's extraordinary capacity for informal agreement. The candidates included R.A. Butler, the hugely experienced politician who had twice been passed over for the leadership, once after Eden and once after Macmillan himself, and who was again, to the astonishment of many and the bitter frustration of his supporters, passed over in favor of the 14th Earl of Home, Alec Douglas Home, a Scottish aristocrat who disclaimed his peerage to stand for election to the Commons and who became Prime Minister as Sir Alec Douglas Home in October 1963. The choice of Douglas Home was remarkable in the context of the moment. Britain was in the middle of a crisis that had been fundamentally about the gap between the establishment's self-serving management of affairs and the welfare of the country, and the Conservative Party's answer to this crisis was to appoint as Prime Minister a man who was the 14th holder of a Scottish earldom, who had famously confessed to calculating economic policy by reference to matchsticks, and who embodied the hereditary principle in British public life with a completeness that would have looked like a deliberate provocation if it had not been so clearly the product of the party's genuine instincts. The October 1964 general election, held a year after Douglas Home took office, was won by Harold Wilson's Labour Party by a majority of 4 seats. 4 seats is not a dramatic margin. It is not the kind of majority that gives governments the freedom to enact transformative legislation without constant attention to the arithmetic of the parliamentary division lobbies. But it ended 13 continuous years of conservative government, and it ended them in circumstances that made the outcome feel, to those who had watched the events of the preceding 3 years, like something more than a routine transfer of power. Whether the Profumo affair directly caused the Labour victory in 1964 is a question that political historians have approached with varying conclusions. Electoral outcomes are driven by many forces simultaneously, and the voters of October 1964 were responding to a complex mixture of economic perceptions, policy preferences, personal assessments of the respective leaders, and all the various local and regional factors that aggregate into election results. The Profumo affair was not the only thing weighing on the Conservative government's reputation. The mismanagement of the economy in the early 1960s, the failure of the application to join the European Common Market vetoed by de Gaulle in January 1963, and the general sense that the party had been in government for too long and had accumulated too many of the habits of complacency that long tenure in power tends to produce, all of these were in the balance as well. But the affair was a weight. It had done a specific kind of damage that these other factors had not done, which was to make the government look not merely wrong or misguided but dishonest and corrupt. The lie told to Parliament by Profumo was a lie that the Prime Minister had, at minimum, been too credulous or too convenient in accepting. The social world that had produced the affair was a world of privilege and self-protection that the general public found it easy to identify as the behavior of people who believed themselves above the rules that applied to everyone else. This kind of damage, the damage to moral credibility, to the sense that those in power were playing by the rules, does not show up cleanly in an electoral analysis, but it accumulates in the way that accumulated water accumulates behind a structure, invisibly and then all at once. Christine Keeler's own experience of the autumn and winter of 1963 was considerably less elevated than the political drama it had generated. She was 21 years old. She had been at the center of one of the most consequential political scandals in British history. She had been used by multiple men for multiple purposes, had been the subject of sustained public exposure and scrutiny, had been characterized in ways that served other people's narratives rather than her own, and had earned from the whole extraordinary experience something closer to notoriety than to the agency or the vindication that a fairer accounting of her role might have produced. In January of 1964, she was convicted of perjury in connection with the Lucky Gordon trial. She had made statements in that proceeding that were found to be false, and was sentenced to 9 months in prison. She served approximately 6 months of that sentence. She was 22 years old when she was released. The men whose lives she had intersected with had, by this point, moved on, Profumo to his extraordinary subsequent career of public service, Macmillan to his memoirs and his reputation as a statesman of the post-war settlement, Ivanov to Moscow, where he returned in January 1963 before the full public eruption of the story, recalled by his handlers with the particular speed of Soviet intelligence when a situation was becoming exposed. Ward was dead. Rachman was dead. Christine Keeler was alive, young, and comprehensively without the resources, financial, social, or psychological, that the experience she had survived might have been expected to produce in someone the political world continued to treat as the occasion for its crisis rather than as one of its central participants. The story was not, by any measure, finished with her. But the other chapters of her story, the subsequent decades of her life, belonged to a different kind of accounting. What the autumn of 1963 marked, for the purposes of this narrative, was the end of the political story in its immediate dimension, the end of the government, the resignation of the Prime Minister, the conviction of Ward, the beginning of a new era in British public life that had been, in some complicated way, cleared of the old order by the scandal that had consumed it. The swimming pool at Cliveden was still there. The river still moved through the meadows below the cliff. The house was still standing, still grand, still catching the afternoon light in that particular way. But the world that had gathered beside that pool on the weekend of July 8, 1961 had, in the 2 years that followed, been dismantled. Not completely, not permanently, but sufficiently that the England that emerged from 1963 was a somewhat different thing from the England that had entered it. The long aftermath of the Profumo affair is a story that runs for decades, and it runs in 2 very different directions. One that traces the arc of consequence for the most powerful participant, and one that traces the arc of consequence for the least powerful, and the contrast between those 2 arcs says as much about the nature of the affair as any of the events that produced it. John Profumo resigned on June 4, 1963. He was 48 years old. He had a wife who stood by him with a loyalty that, given what she had been through, commands a respect that the record has not always adequately extended to her. He had a reputation that was, in the public mind, defined by a single act of dishonesty committed in the worst possible forum, before the worst possible audience, in circumstances that could not be redeemed by subsequent good conduct within the political world because he had removed himself from the political world entirely. What he did instead was to go to work. He went to Toynbee Hall, the charitable institution in the East End of London that had been a center of social provision for the poor of that area since the 19th century. He went as a volunteer. He cleaned toilets. He cared for people who needed care. He did this without a press release and without seeking coverage, and he did it not for a year or 2 in the hope that a period of visible contrition would restore his reputation, but for 5 continuous decades, working his way through increasingly significant roles at the institution until he was eventually serving as its chair. He fundraised on its behalf. He organized its events. He used the social connections that had survived his fall, and some had survived, because even the most total collapse of public reputation does not remove all personal loyalty, in the service of an institution that served people who had nothing. He was appointed CBE in 1975 for his charity work. At the dinner at 10 Downing Street that followed Margaret Thatcher's election victory in 1979, he sat at the top table, restored to a version of the establishment that had cast him out 16 years earlier. Whether this restoration was deserved, whether the redemption arc of a man who had committed perjury before the House of Commons could be completed by decades of good works, is a question about moral accounting that different people answer differently. What is documented is the work itself, which was real, sustained, and by all accounts conducted without pretension or self-promotion. He died on March 9, 2006, at the age of 91. He had outlived most of the people who had known the affair from the inside. He had also outlived the era it belonged to, which had itself long since passed away and been succeeded by something rather different. Valerie Hobson had died in November 1998. She had stood by her husband throughout the 53 years following the scandal, never making public capital from her position as the political wife who had been most visibly betrayed by the affair, never writing a memoir or giving interviews about the private experience of what she had endured. She died with the same quiet dignity she had carried through the worst years, and the record of her conduct in this matter is one of the more overlooked aspects of the entire story. Christine Keeler's subsequent life was constructed in far less forgiving conditions. She was released from prison in 1964, at the age of 22, and found herself in a public landscape in which she was famous in the specific way that notoriety produces, recognized everywhere, respected almost nowhere, the subject of a kind of attention that expressed itself as scrutiny rather than warmth. She was not, to the people who made decisions about employment or opportunities or the practical business of daily life, a person who had been exploited and who deserved support. She was the woman from the scandal, and the scandal had settled over her in a way that did not settle over the powerful men who had been its other participants. She married twice, both marriages proving unsuccessful. She had 2 sons. She struggled financially throughout much of her adult life, moving between addresses and circumstances with the precariousness of someone who had never been given the foundations on which a stable life could be constructed, and who had not been able to build those foundations herself in the subsequent years. She wrote memoirs, several at various stages of her life, and the later ones in particular carry the quality of a woman who is still, decades later, trying to give an accurate account of something that other people have consistently misrepresented, trying to assert her perspective against the weight of a story that was always told from someone else's vantage. The story of the Profumo affair has been dramatized numerous times, in films, in television productions, in theatrical treatments, and Christine's representation in these productions has varied in the degree to which it managed to present her as a person rather than as a symbol. Joanna Lumley played her in a 1989 television film. She was played by Sophie Cookson in the 2018 ITV drama that took her name as its title and which, by most critical assessments, did more to present the specific complexity of her position than most previous dramatizations had managed. The 2018 production used Christine's own later accounts as a primary source, and the version of the story it presented, which emphasized her youth, her exploitation, her lack of protection and genuine agency, found a receptive audience in a cultural moment that had been significantly reshaped by conversations about power, consent, and the specific vulnerability of young women in environments controlled by older and more powerful men. Christine Keeler died on December 4, 2017, at the age of 75. She died in relative obscurity, in the kind of circumstances that her life had moved through for decades. Not poor but not comfortable, not forgotten but not properly acknowledged. A woman whose name remained famous while the reality of her experience remained improperly understood by most of the people who invoked it. The obituaries were generous and, in many cases, explicitly revisionist. They worked to correct the long-settled impression of her as the provocateur of events she had actually been the victim of, and to restore to the record the specific quality of her experience as a young woman from a poor background who had been drawn into a world she had not created and could not control. Mandy Rice Davies had a considerably different subsequent life. She moved to Israel, where she built a successful career as a nightclub owner and entrepreneur, married 3 times, wrote memoirs and a novel, and appeared in films and television productions with a cheerful lack of embarrassment about her past that the English public found either admirable or irritating, depending on its temperament. She acquired, through the particular alchemy of celebrity that the 1960s produced, a kind of affectionate notoriety, the woman who had said, "Well, he would, wouldn't he?" In the Ward trial, when she was told that Lord Astor denied having slept with her, and who had become, through that single sentence, a figure of representative British common sense confronting aristocratic pretension. She died in December 2014, at the age of 70, still talking about the affair with the same directness she had brought to the proceedings at the Old Bailey in 1963. The intelligence dimensions of the story were never definitively resolved. Ivanov returned to Moscow in January 1963, before the full public explosion of the affair, and lived a quiet life until his death in January 1994. He gave an interview in the early 1990s in which he confirmed the facts of his relationship with Christine and discussed his assessment of the affair from the Soviet perspective. He denied that he had gathered any significant intelligence through the Ward network, which may or may not have been true. The Soviet archives that were briefly more accessible in the immediate post-Soviet period have not resolved the question with the clarity that historians would prefer, and the relevant GRU files remain classified. The questions about MI5's handling of the affair, whether the security service was adequately alert, whether it acted on the information it had with appropriate speed, whether the informal management of the situation was a failure of institutional design or simply of institutional judgment in a specific case, have occupied intelligence historians in the decades since. The allegations about Roger Hollis, the MI5 Director General, that he may himself have been a Soviet penetration agent, allegations made most prominently by Peter Wright in his controversial memoir Spycatcher, published in 1987, were examined by official inquiries and found unproven. The suggestion has not been entirely buried, but neither has it been conclusively established, and the weight of informed opinion tends toward the view that Hollis was not a Soviet agent, but that he was a cautious and perhaps insufficiently decisive institutional manager who failed to push hard enough on a situation that warranted more aggressive attention. The Profumo affair's legacy in British political culture was both specific and diffuse. It was specific in the particular changes it produced, in the conventions around the handling of security matters involving ministers, in the awareness within the intelligence community of the specific risks that informal social networks could generate, in the somewhat heightened vigilance in subsequent decades about the personal conduct of people in positions of access to classified information. The Denning report itself produced recommendations about procedure that were implemented in the years following its publication. But the legacy was also diffuse in a way that is harder to measure but more profoundly consequential. The Profumo affair was one of the primary mechanisms through which the deference that British culture had extended to its established institutions since the Victorian era was cracked open and the cracks made visible. The whole structure of the scandal, the way that the establishment had protected one of its own, the way that the intelligence services had issued a gentle word where a formal intervention was warranted, the way that Parliament had accepted a lie because the constitutional conventions required it to treat a member's statement as honorable, the way that a young woman from a poor background had been used and then prosecuted while the powerful men around her quietly withdrew. All of it told a story about the English class system that the English working class already knew and that the English educated class was being forced, for perhaps the first time in the modern era, to acknowledge as specific and documented fact. The satire that was produced by the affair, the attacks in Private Eye, the television programs, the theatrical performances, the journalism, hardened into a cultural attitude that was considerably less forgiving of authority than anything that had been standard before it. The journalists who had been constrained by libel law and by deference began to operate with more aggression. The politicians who had assumed that their private conduct was protected by the informal conventions of the establishment found those conventions under sustained challenge. The next decade, the decade of investigative journalism, of parliamentary reform, of the eventual dismantling of various forms of institutional privilege, was not caused by the Profumo affair, but the affair contributed to the conditions that made such changes possible and that made the public appetite for them real. None of this amounted to justice for Christine Keeler. She did not receive justice in the conventional sense from the events she had been part of, and the cultural reckoning that came later, the television drama with her name on it, the obituaries that acknowledged her exploitation, arrived 50 years too late to change the experience of the life she had actually lived. The railway carriage in Wraysbury, the departed father, the cramped and narrow beginning. None of the subsequent events had retroactively provided the foundation that those beginnings had denied her. She had passed through the extraordinary center of a story that remade a government and revealed an establishment, and she had emerged from it into decades of difficulty that the men around her never experienced in comparable form. She was, in the end, the person who best understood what the whole story was actually about. She had been in the rooms. She had been present for the decisions, even if she had not been the one making them. She had watched, from the particular vantage of someone with nothing to lose by seeing clearly, exactly how power operated, exactly how the establishment managed its contradictions, exactly what the gracious invitation and the swimming pool at Cliveden and the letter signed J and the personal statement to the House of Commons had actually cost, and who had paid for them. The story of the Profumo affair is usually told as the story of a politician who lied. That is true as far as it goes. But it is more honestly understood as the story of a society that organized itself in ways that made that lie possible, that protected the conditions in which such lies are produced, and that, when those conditions were finally exposed, chose to prosecute the least powerful person in the room rather than examine honestly what the room itself revealed about the nature of its own arrangements. Christine Keeler was 19 years old when she swam in the pool at Cliveden. She was 75 years old when she died, still carrying the name of a story that was always about far more than her. The story outlived her, but she outlived the story's misrepresentation of her, at least long enough to see the record beginning, slowly, to be corrected. That is not enough. It never quite is. But it is what the record provides.